Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into one of history's strangest rabbit holes, the world of medieval royalty and what happens when you keep marrying your cousins for a few too many generations. Spoiler alert, it's not good. You probably won't survive this journey genetically speaking, but it is fascinating. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm curious, what city are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far this sleepy little history community stretches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this: the crackling of fire in a stone hall, flicker of candlelight catching on silver goblets, and a young noblewoman in velvet robes being introduced to her future husband, who is also casually her cousin, or her uncle, or her nephew. Welcome to the elite world of medieval European aristocracy, where bloodlines mattered more than biology and love had absolutely nothing to do with marriage. The term inbred carries a punch today, but in the medieval context it was strategy. Dynasties like the Habsburgs, the Capetians and the Trastamaras didn't just intermarry for fun. They did it to hoard power, land and legitimacy. If you marry your cousin, you don't lose any castles. If you marry a foreigner, suddenly someone else is raising your heir in a rival kingdom. So the logic was clear even if the consequences weren't. Yet over generations, that logic led to genetic whirlpools that birthed some of the most fascinating and tragic figures in European history. You're going to meet women tonight who are daughters of double first cousins, nieces married to their uncles, and sisters married off to their first cousin once removed. These aren't just mathematical absurdities, they were real women with complicated lives, deep loyalties, and sometimes shocking symptoms of what happens when your DNA plays the royal version of musical chairs. We'll visit stone palaces in Spain, gloomy castles in Austria, and glittering courts in France and the Low Countries. You'll watch as empires rise and fall around these women, many of whom, let's be honest, never got a say in the matter. Take the Habsburgs, for instance, the undisputed champions of European inbreeding. Their family tree isn't so much a tree as a wreath. They built a global empire on marriages, each one drawing the family net tighter until it practically strangled itself. And while we'll spend time with some of the more infamous male Habsburgs later, it's the women who carried the generational load, both politically and genetically. These women were the mothers of kings and queens, the breeders of empire, and the unfortunate bearers of some truly unlucky traits. But it wasn't just the Habsburgs. The Capetians of France, the Trastamaras of Spain, and even the Plantagenets of England dipped their toes in the same shallow gene pool. The goal was always the same: consolidate claims, prevent civil war, and lock down dynastic legitimacy. But with that came feuds, forced marriages, and a trail of noble women who spent their lives navigating a world where family meant everything and meant way too much. What's wild is how obvious some of the side effects became over time: elongated jaws, fertility issues, recurring mental illness, stillbirths, and strangely shaped skulls pop up again and again in royal lineages, yet nobody seemed all that eager to change course. Even the church, which technically forbade incestuous marriages past a certain degree, made exceptions for royals. The Pope would often grant a dispensation, basically a holy permission slip for yet another cousin marriage, as long as it kept the peace. Here's the kicker: modern geneticists have actually studied some of these lineages and confirmed what those medieval matchmakers refused to see. Inbreeding coefficients, yes, that's a thing, are measurable, and several royal offspring had scores comparable to the children of sibling unions. One of the highest ever recorded, Charles II of Spain, whose tragic tale we'll save for the end. But spoiler, he couldn't chew food properly, couldn't walk without help, and likely had the mental development of a 5-year-old. And yes, he had a lot of aunts and uncles who were also his cousins. Of course, not every royal woman with a tangled ancestry suffered overtly. Some were brilliant rulers, effective diplomats, and adored queens. One of the fringe debates among historians today is just how much inbreeding actually influenced personality or mental stability. For example, was Joanna the Mad of Castile actually insane, or just caught in a brutal political trap where her erratic behaviour was exaggerated to keep her from ruling? Was her daughter's melancholy a symptom of family genetics or the result of a lifetime trapped between power and duty? This kind of question pops up a lot when you start pulling threads on these women's lives. How much was nature and how much was nurture? These women weren't just passive figures, They were queens, regents, and mothers shaping the future of empires. Some of them ruled directly, others ruled through their sons or husbands, and they all bore the burden of dynastic duty in a way their male counterparts didn't. A prince might go off to war or drink himself to death, but a princess was expected to marry whomever the crown required and produce heirs, no matter how many miscarriages, deformities, or depressions came along the way. In the next sections, we'll meet specific women whose stories exemplify this strange intersection of politics, genetics, and deeply personal struggle. You'll follow Isabella of Habsburg as her bloodline loops inward, Joanna of Castile as her sanity is questioned, and Eleanor of Portugal as she marries her own uncle to cement imperial power. Along the way, we'll sprinkle in facts you've never heard before, like which queen's jaw had to be redrawn in official portraits, or which princess was technically her husband's great-aunt. So buckle up, gently. The next few hours might just make you grateful for your boring, unroyal DNA. So let's head straight into the tangled tapestry of inbred nobility, with a woman who is practically the poster child for what happens when your entire family tree folds in on itself like an origami disaster. Isabella of Habsburg. If you've ever wondered what it's like to be the result of multiple generations of cousin marriages, well, meet Isabella. She doesn't just belong to the Habsburg dynasty, she is the Habsburg dynasty, rolled up into one velvet-draped, highly ceremonial genetic loop. Born in 1501, Isabella was the daughter of Philip the Handsome and Joanna of Castile, aka Joanna the Mad, who we'll meet properly in the next section. For now, just note that Isabella's parents were both grandchildren of the same royal couple, John II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile. That means Isabella's family tree was already bending awkwardly in on itself from the moment she cried her first baby cry in Brussels. And by the time she reached marrying age, around 13 because of course she did, her value wasn't about her smile or her charm, it was all about the blood, that Habsburg blood. She was married off to Christian II of Denmark, Norway and Sweden, a man described by contemporaries as mercurial, which is a polite way of saying he was probably a bit of a nightmare. Their marriage was political like every marriage of the age, but it also had an edge of desperation. Christian needed allies, and the Habsburgs needed influence in Scandinavia. Isabella was the literal body through which that influence would flow. Her uterus was now official royal policy. Here's where it gets complicated, because of course it does. Christian wasn't exactly stable. He was charming at times, yes, and he clearly liked Isabella, but he also had a favourite mistress, Dyveke Sigbritsdatter, whom he refused to abandon even after marrying the Habsburg princess. Dyveke was low-born, not even nobility, and Isabella had to sit there in her Danish castle, pregnant with the future, while her husband paraded his mistress around court like a new horse. That must have stung, even for someone raised to accept political marriages as part of the royal gig. But Isabella held her own. She bore Christian 6 children, 3 of whom survived infancy, which in itself was a miracle, given the gene pool and the general medieval lack of sanitation. One of her sons, John, would have a short life, but her daughter Dorothea would go on to marry another cousin naturally. Isabella's influence at court grew, particularly after Dyveke died suddenly, maybe from poisoned cherries, maybe not. The truth is murky, and so are the rumours. Some whispered that Isabella or her allies had a hand in it, but there's no hard proof. Just a sudden vacancy in the royal mistress role and a queen who stepped up into real power. And yet the genetic weight of her ancestry didn't disappear. Isabella herself suffered from bouts of illness that some historians now think might have been linked to haemophilia, or a similar inherited disorder. She died young, just 24 years old. The official cause? A sudden illness, the medieval catch-all term for anything from tuberculosis to a stroke to, well, inherited genetic dysfunctions we can't pin down from the comfort of our modern armchairs. A quirky fact about Isabella's brief life: she was fluent in at least 5 languages, thanks to her Habsburg upbringing. These weren't "I can ask where the bathroom is" skills either. She could hold diplomatic conversations in Latin, Castilian, Flemish, French and German. Her letters reveal a sharp mind, a touch of sarcasm, and a keen understanding of the politics around her. She wasn't just a vessel for babies, she was aware of the chessboard and moved across it as much as her gender allowed. Now here's where scholars still butt heads. Was Isabella a victim of her family's obsession with purity, or simply unlucky in a dangerous age? Some point to her children's weak health and her own early death as clear signs of genetic fragility. Others argue that early mortality was just par for the course in the 16th century, even for royals. And while that's true to an extent, the Habsburgs' increasingly closed breeding circles make the debate harder to ignore. What's not debated is this: Isabella's children carried forward even more concentrated royal blood, making the next generation of Habsburgs even more genetically enclosed. Her grandson, Maximilian II, would marry his first cousin, and their children? Well, let's just say their jawlines could cut glass, and not in a good way. One eerie thing about Isabella's life is how quiet it feels in retrospect. She's one of those queens you rarely hear about unless you go looking. No big wars, no grand scandals, no famous paintings, and yet her DNA echoes all through European history. Her blood ran in the veins of emperors, kings, and doomed heirs. If power in this world can be measured by legacy, then Isabella was more powerful than most of the men around her. She just didn't get a crown to show it. You almost want to go back in time and whisper to her through the veil of centuries on. Hey, maybe skip that cousin. Maybe tell your daughter to try someone new, like someone not related. But you know she couldn't. That was the game, and she played it as well as anyone with her last name could. From the quiet courts of Denmark to the loud echoes of dynastic strategy, Isabella of Habsburg's life is one of the clearest examples of what happens when royalty values family ties just a bit too much. She didn't live long, but what she passed on would shape Europe for the next 2 centuries, and a lot of those results weren't exactly healthy. Now that you've met Isabella of Habsburg, it's time to step even deeper into the foggy Gothic corridors of royal heredity and meet her mother, Joanna of Castile, or, as she's better known in the history books, Joanna the Mad. You've probably heard the nickname before. Maybe you picture her wandering a castle barefoot, mumbling to herself, or clutching her dead husband's coffin like a morbid romantic. And yeah, some of that actually happened. But the full story of Joanna, it's less madness, more tragedy, with a generous sprinkle of dynastic pressure, and of course a heavy dose of concentrated family genetics. Joanna was born in 1479 to Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, Spain's power couple, the Catholic monarchs who unified the Spanish kingdoms and sponsored a certain Christopher Columbus. Their marriage was the ultimate political power move, and they wanted their children to follow suit. Joanna was their third child, smart, reserved and devout, with eyes that reportedly smouldered when she was angry. But there was one catch. Her family tree already had that classic royal kink. Her parents were second cousins, not a terrible start by medieval standards, but the signs of internal looping were starting to flicker. As a young woman, Joanna was shipped off to Flanders to marry Philip the Handsome. Yes, that's literally what they called him. And yes, it was mostly for politics. Philip was the son of Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian IV and Mary of Burgundy, and this union was meant to forge a powerful European alliance. But unlike many arranged royal marriages, Joanna and Philip were weirdly into each other, like passionately, obsessively into each other, at first. The kind of chemistry that raised eyebrows at court. You might think, oh, that's sweet. But this is a bedtime history, not a fairy tale, so you know what's coming. Philip was charming, ambitious, and very aware of his own good looks. Joanna, deeply in love, became intensely jealous, especially once Philip began openly cheating on her. She would reportedly scream and throw things and demand to know the names of his mistresses. Court rumour had it that she once attacked a lady-in-waiting with scissors over a flirtatious glance. Was she mentally ill? Or just a woman pushed to the edge in a world where her power was always second to her husband's pleasure? Things only got worse when her mother, Queen Isabella, died and Joanna became Queen of Castile. On paper, this should have made her one of the most powerful women in Europe, but Philip wasn't having it. He tried to muscle in as king, claiming Joanna was too unstable to rule. Her father, Ferdinand, did the same thing. Both men wanted control over Castile, and both used Joanna's supposed madness as an excuse to take it from her. What followed was a slow, relentless campaign to paint her as unfit, a narrative that stuck, partly because it was convenient and partly because Joanna did start to show signs of emotional collapse. After Philip's sudden death in 1506, he reportedly drank cold water after playing a vigorous game of ball, and it shocked his system, which, yeah, sounds fake. Joanna's grief became extreme. This is where the famous coffin story comes in. She had his body embalmed, refused to bury it for years, and travelled with the casket across Castile, stopping at monasteries and demanding prayers for his soul. Some say she opened the coffin periodically to gaze at him. Others claim she refused to allow any women near it, fearing they might seduce his corpse. Okay, that part does edge into mental illness territory. But hold on, this is where modern historians start side-eyeing the narrative. Yes, Joanna's behaviour was eccentric, even disturbing, but was it madness or grief, weaponised by power-hungry men? She had just lost her husband, was being isolated from her children, and had everyone around her gaslighting her into thinking she was unwell. Even her attendants were under orders to keep her under control. When you're locked away in a cold castle with no friends, no allies, and a lifetime of dynastic expectation weighing on you, madness might just be the only way out. Here's the genetic kicker. Joanna's parents were related, Sind, and her husband was her second cousin. Their child, Isabella from the last section, was part of a lineage that was now officially swirling in on itself. And you can track Joanna's bloodline straight down to Charles II of Spain, whose family tree looks like a family tumbleweed. Also, here's a fringe fact you're not going to hear in most textbooks. Some 16th century doctors actually believed that uterine misalignment caused female madness, as in they thought her womb had literally travelled to her head. No joke. One account from a Spanish physician describes Joanna as being afflicted with a wandering womb, which they thought caused her hysteria. The solution? Herbal compresses, prayer, and once, wait for it, a suggested exorcism. Modern scholars love to debate whether Joanna really had what we'd now call bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, or whether she was a victim of socio-political abuse. One particularly interesting theory suggests she may have had a form of post-traumatic stress disorder brought on by constant betrayal and the deaths of her children. Because yes, while she was confined in Tordesillas for nearly 50 years, her children died one by one, usually far from her. She was denied the chance to raise them, see them, or even grieve them properly. And yet, through all this, she remained technically Queen of Castile. Her signature still sealed royal decrees. Her presence still mattered, if only as a figurehead. And the dynasty rolled on, through her blood and her heartbreak. So what's the takeaway here? Joanna wasn't just the mad one, she was the product of strategic inbreeding, the pawn of rival male egos, and maybe, just maybe, a woman who saw too much and cracked under the pressure. But her legacy didn't crack. Her children would go on to shape Europe, and her story remains one of the most haunting examples of what happens when you mix too much royal blood with too little compassion. Next, we'll meet another woman from a royal bloodline tangled in its own reflection, Blanche of Castile, who finds herself caught in the push-pull of French and Spanish dynasties. But first, let Joanna linger in your mind for a moment. Alone in a fortress, her world shrinking, her love unburied, her name etched into history not for what she did, but for what they said she was. Now your eyes drift toward another castle corridor, lit by a flickering rushlight and echoing with footsteps that trace centuries-old ambitions. Tonight, we cross the Pyrenees into a tale not quite as gothic as Joanna's, but every bit as woven with dynastic pressure and genetic déjà vu. Meet Blanche of Castile. She doesn't get the kind of historical spotlight that queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Catherine de Medici basked in, but don't let that fool you. Blanche was a linchpin in one of Europe's most tangled noble nets, and like many royal women of the time, she was born into a family already looping back in on itself. Blanche came into the world in 1188, the daughter of King Alfonso VIII of Castile and Eleanor of England. Yes, that Eleanor, daughter of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. That made Blanche a granddaughter of two powerful dynasties. Her blood was a potent blend of English Plantagenet ambition and Spanish Trastamara pride. It also meant her family tree had already begun its slow spiral, because the Castilian and French royal lines weren't shy about marrying cousins when it kept power close. At the age of 12, Blanche was sent off to France to marry Louis, the son of King Philip II. But hang on, she wasn't actually the original choice. The French had originally wanted her sister, Urraca, but when a last-minute switch-up happened, one that scholars still squint at with suspicion, Blanche was plucked instead. Why the change? Some say Urraca was too Spanish, or that Blanche simply had a better temperament. Others hint at something less flattering. Urraca may have shown signs of inherited instability, and the French crown didn't want to risk it. Whether that's true or just a smear campaign cloaked in diplomacy, we'll never know for sure. Blanche married Louis VIII of France in 1200 and quickly proved herself far more than a ceremonial wife. When Louis became king, she stepped up not just in courtly presence, but as a political force. And when he died in 1226, leaving their son Louis IX, later St. Louis, as a boy king of 12, Blanche didn't blink. She declared herself regent and ran France like a queen who'd been waiting a whole life for the chance. And she had. While other women were sewing tapestries and birthing heirs, Blanche was drafting treaties, intimidating barons, and keeping the fragile Capetian hold on France intact. But here's the part we're here for. Blanche's bloodline. She and Louis VIII were third cousins, close enough that the church had to grant a dispensation for the marriage. It wasn't exactly scandalous by the standards of the day, but it was part of a growing pattern of dynasties interweaving themselves so tightly that marriage options became less about finding a match and more about finding someone you weren't related to. And with Blanche, that issue just kept compounding. She had 13 children, though only a few survived to adulthood. Louis IX, of course, became a king and later a saint, but scholars have often pointed out that several of his siblings had health problems or died young. Common, yes, but statistically higher than normal even for the time. One theory suggests Blanche and Louis's shared Plantagenet ancestry may have carried some form of inherited immune weakness, though this remains speculative. Another quirky rumour, that Blanche was so obsessed with keeping her son pure that she discouraged him from sleeping with his wife. Some even whispered that she had an unnatural attachment to him, though that's probably more medieval gossip than reliable record. Still, it speaks to the way Blanche was viewed. Intense, commanding, and always just a bit unsettling. You don't get to rule as a woman in the 13th century without people throwing a little suspicion your way, especially if you're doing it successfully. And Blanche was successful. She not only held France together during her son's minority, but she later returned to regency when he left for crusade. For years, she governed with a stern hand and a sharp eye, navigating rebellions, famine, and papal politics with barely a stumble. But the toll on her family, and possibly her children's health, remained an undercurrent. One scholarly debate that's still alive today was Blanche herself subtly affected by the genetic tightrope her family walked. While there's no record of physical deformity or obvious illness, some letters suggest she suffered from extreme migraines and recurring melancholia, that lovely medieval catch-all that could mean depression, hormonal imbalance, or something passed along the family line like a well-polished heirloom. There's also a fascinating detail from her death in 1252. Reportedly, she collapsed on the way to a convent and lingered in pain for days, murmuring prayers and hallucinating visions of saints. Some modern readers interpret this as spiritual ecstasy. Others, less romantically, wonder if it was a stroke or hereditary neurological condition. Again, no definitive answers, just a woman's final days shrouded in mystery, much like her life. Here's a lesser-known fact. Blanche was one of the first French queens to actively sponsor universities. She supported the development of theology studies at the University of Paris and personally funded monastic libraries. So yeah, while she was wrangling rebellious nobles and managing her emotionally complicated son, she was also quietly helping launch the European intellectual renaissance. No big deal. You can almost imagine her today, ghosting through a candle-lit library in Rouen, muttering Latin aphorisms and glaring disapprovingly at anyone making noise. Not mad, not tragic, just tired, and probably still running things from beyond the grave. So while Blanche of Castile isn't the most inbred woman on our list, she represents an early example of how medieval power marriages began to fold back in on themselves, and how royal women, burdened with bloodlines and expectations, carved out their legacies anyway, sometimes with iron fists hidden beneath silken sleeves. Next, we'll travel to Portugal, where Eleanor of Portugal finds herself pulled into a family dynamic so twisted that her groom shares not just her family name, but her uncle's face. Hope you're ready for that one. And now, let's take a soft step into the warm Iberian air of the 15th century, where stone palaces glint beneath the Portuguese sun, and royal carriages creak beneath the weight of more than just gold and silk. They carry dynastic expectations, ancient rivalries, and the kind of family ties that require both a wedding and a DNA test. Tonight's central figure, Eleanor of Portugal. If you're already cringing at the thought of an uncle becoming a husband, congratulations. You're awake and paying attention. Because yes, that actually happened. And it wasn't even considered all that weird at the time. Eleanor was born in 1434 into the House of Avias, a branch of the Portuguese royal family, known for its tangled roots and political ambitions. She was one of several children born to King Edward of Portugal and Eleanor of Aragon, which already made her a prize in the international marriage market. Her siblings included future kings and queens, but Eleanor's path would take her north, into the chilly reaches of the Holy Roman Empire, where her marriage was supposed to cement a powerful alliance. What no one talked about at the wedding feast was how closely she and her groom were already related. Her husband, Emperor Frederick III, was not only her cousin, but he was technically her uncle, through marriage lines so convoluted they practically form a Celtic knot. But of course, inbreeding among royals wasn't just tolerated, it was the norm. Marrying a close relative wasn't scandalous. It was strategic. If it kept the throne within the family and prevented rival claims, then so be it. The Pope would give a little nod of approval, issue a dispensation, and another cousinly kiss would seal the fate of another generation. Eleanor's wedding to Frederick was awkward from the start. She travelled to Italy for the ceremony, which was delayed several times because Frederick, ever the cautious emperor, was reluctant to commit. He reportedly didn't even meet her until the actual wedding day, and his first reaction was, "She's prettier than her portrait, so yay for low expectations." The wedding finally went through in 1452, and Eleanor became Holy Roman Empress, one of the most powerful titles in Christendom. But power doesn't guarantee happiness. Their marriage was strained. Eleanor, raised in the more relaxed and artistically rich courts of Portugal, found Frederick's court cold, rigid, and depressingly frugal. He was obsessed with bureaucracy and finances. She wanted music, colour, and life. Letters from the time hinted her frustration. She reportedly once said that her husband would rather count coins than kiss his wife. Yikes. Meanwhile, Frederick found Eleanor too emotional, too passionate, how's this for irony, too foreign. Still, they did their dynastic duty and had 5 children, 3 of whom survived infancy. Among them was Maximilian I, who would go on to become Holy Roman Emperor and marry yet another cousin, solidifying the Habsburg rise to power. But Eleanor, she struggled. Her health began to deteriorate, possibly from the strain of pregnancies, long cold winters, and the slow suffocation of life with a man who treated her more like an economic advisor than a wife. Now, let's talk about the genetics. Eleanor and Frederick's shared bloodline was already layered with intermarriage. Both had ancestors from the Aragonese and Burgundian houses, and their union concentrated that blood further. The result? Their son Maximilian inherited the family jaw, the early hints of the legendary Habsburg jaw that would come to symbolise centuries of royal inbreeding. But that's just the visible sign. What historians whisper about more quietly is the mental health issues, miscarriages, and the faint echo of autoimmune disorders that crop up again and again in the family line. A quirky side note, Eleanor is one of the few medieval empresses whose voice survives in her own hand. Some of her letters to her brother, King Afonso V of Portugal, still exist. In them she vents about court life, the isolation she feels, and how much she misses home. There's something hauntingly modern about her complaints. She talks about not having anyone to confide in, about feeling like an outsider even in her own family, and about the cold halls of the imperial court that seem to suck the life out of her. If there's a ghost pacing through those stone corridors at Grals or Wiener Neustadt, it's probably Eleanor, still homesick and misunderstood. Here's where scholarly debate still flickers. Was Eleanor simply a mismatched wife trapped in a political alliance? Or was she experiencing the early toll of genetic accumulation? Her declining health has been attributed to everything from tuberculosis to depression, but some researchers suggest she may have inherited a form of porphyria, a blood disorder linked to noble lineages, and sometimes mistaken for madness or hysteria. There's no conclusive evidence, just hints in her letters and descriptions from court chroniclers about her pallor, sensitivity to light, and frequent fits of melancholy. She died young, just 32 years old. Officially it was illness, but most agree it was a long and painful slide into frailty, worsened by years of emotional neglect and probably some good old-fashioned medieval medical malpractice. Frederick didn't even attend her funeral. He stayed behind, reportedly busy with court documents. That tells you everything, doesn't it? And yet Eleanor's legacy looms large. Her son Maximilian would go on to shape European history, expanding the Habsburg Empire and marrying his own relatives with relentless efficiency. Eleanor's blood would flow through the veins of emperors and queens, carrying with it both the strength of her Iberian heritage and the weaknesses of a gene pool that had been stirred far too little. What stands out most about Eleanor is the quiet sadness that threads through her life. She wasn't mad like Joanna. She wasn't iron-willed like Blanche. She was soft-edged, romantic, and ultimately too human for the cold machinery of imperial politics. But she played her part. She gave birth to the next dynasty, and that for a royal woman of her time was the highest and most unforgiving form of success. Next, we'll meet Margaret of Austria, Eleanor's granddaughter, and one of the sharpest political minds of her day. Raised in a family so genetically compact that holiday dinners probably required a family tree cheat sheet just to figure out who to kiss on the cheek. Now imagine this. You're a young girl born into a labyrinth of castles, cousins and kings, and before you've even lost your baby teeth, you're already being discussed like a valuable chess piece. That was Margaret of Austria. And yes, she's technically the granddaughter of Eleanor of Portugal, but by this point the Habsburg family line has twisted itself into such tight knots that even the family dog might have qualified for a noble title. Margaret grew up in the very eye of this dynastic storm, trained to smile, curtsy and marry strategically. But what makes her stand out in this parade of inbred nobility is that she didn't just survive the system, she mastered it. Born in 1480 in Brussels, Margaret was the daughter of Maximilian I, the Holy Roman Emperor and son of, you guessed it, Frederick and Eleanor. Her mother, Mary of Burgundy, died young after falling off a horse, which left Margaret motherless by age 2. Right out of the cradle, she was seen not as a grieving child, but as a dynastic prize. Her father immediately betrothed her to the French Dauphin, Charles, who was barely older than her and would later become King Charles VIII. At the ripe old age of 3, Margaret was shipped off to the French court to be raised as the future Queen of France. As far as political gambits go, it was classic Habsburg. Start young, lock in alliances early, and hope nobody dies in the meantime. But things didn't go according to plan. When Charles reached marrying age, he ditched Margaret and instead married Anne of Brittany, a major territorial win, but a total slap in the face to the girl who had grown up in his palace. Margaret, still a teenager, was unceremoniously returned to her father, heartbroken and politically bruised. If she cried on the way home, no one wrote it down, but from this point on she started building a different kind of power. She was married off again, this time to John of Castile, heir to the Spanish throne. Yes, that same Spanish royal line that came from her own tangled ancestry. Once again, the genes looped together, like tangled Christmas lights. Margaret and John were cousins several times over, connected through both the Habsburg and Trastamara lines. Their marriage was brief. John died within a year, probably from tuberculosis, though rumours of poison floated around because, well, medieval courts loved a little conspiracy with their mourning. Margaret, now widowed before age 20, might have been expected to fade into the background and quietly become a nun or a melancholy dowager. But nope, not Margaret. She returned to the Habsburg court and slowly, steadily carved out a political identity so sharp it could slice through stained glass. She never remarried, instead dedicating herself to politics and governance, eventually becoming governor of the Netherlands. Twice, that's right. A royal woman governing a powerful economic hub while maintaining diplomatic relations with France, Spain and England. And she did it all while wearing gowns so stiff with embroidery they could stand on their own. Now, let's not forget the inbreeding elephant in the room. Margaret's entire family was deep into cousin territory. Her father, Maximilian I, had married his cousin. Her brother, Philip the Handsome, would marry Joanna of Castile, who was also their cousin. Margaret herself had married her cousin. The Habsburg family tree by this point resembled a Mobius strip, and you can start to see the effects. Her brother Philip died young of fever, and his son Charles V would inherit so much consolidated genetic baggage that his chin could be spotted from orbit. But Margaret, she didn't seem to suffer physically from the family's favoured marital policies. She was sharp, healthy for most of her life, and politically astute. Some historians point to her as a rare example of a Habsburg woman who defied the decline. Still, her life wasn't untouched by the consequences. As guardian of her niece and nephew, Charles V and his siblings, she was intimately aware of the psychological and physical toll the family bloodlines were starting to take. One of her nieces, Eleanor of Austria, would go on to marry yet another cousin. Another, Catherine, would marry King John III of Portugal, her double first cousin. Margaret arranged many of these marriages herself, fully aware of the genetics involved, but also boxed in by political necessity. A quirky fact, Margaret had a pet monkey named Barb and was famously fond of her collection of books, tapestries and art. She was also an avid letter writer. Her correspondence with her cousin, the famed humanist Erasmus, reveals a woman of intelligence, wit and occasional dry sarcasm. In one letter, she describes a courtier as having the charm of a leaky wine barrel, which frankly should be embroidered on a pillow. Scholars still debate just how powerful Margaret really was. Some say she was merely a figurehead, executing the plans of her male relatives. Others argue she was the puppet master, subtly influencing the direction of Habsburg Europe from behind the velvet curtain. There's evidence for both. What's certain is that kings wrote to her for advice, ambassadors reported to her, and her policies kept the Netherlands relatively stable during years of upheaval. Not bad for someone who'd been used like a pawn in 2 failed marriages before her 20th birthday. Margaret died in 1530 at age 50 from complications after stepping on a nail, proving that not even imperial savvy can save you from tetanus. But her death was deeply mourned. Even Erasmus wrote in grief, saying that Europe had lost one of its finest minds, not one of its finest women, mind you, its finest minds. High praise from a Renaissance intellectual. In the end, Margaret of Austria stands as a sharp contrast to so many of the tragic, wilting flowers that populate royal family trees. She may have been born from the same inbred tangle, but she bloomed on her own terms. She arranged the very marriages that would further twist her family's genetic fabric, yes, but not out of cruelty or blindness. She was playing the only game allowed to her, and she played it better than most. Next, we'll head into England to meet one of Margaret's future sisters-in-law by marriage, Catherine of Aragon. Another princess of Castile, another victim of the cousins' stacking, and the woman who would eventually face off with Henry VIII in a marital battle for the ages. You hear the clink of golden goblets, the rustle of silk skirts, the echo of Latin prayers drifting through a stone chapel lit by thin beams of morning light. You're in England now. Early 16th century, just before everything goes off the rails, and at the centre of this poised, polished moment is a young woman with a serene smile and a bloodline more knotted than a sailor's test. Catherine of Aragon. You probably know her as Henry VIII's first wife, the one he dumped for Anne Boleyn, sparking his religious firestorm and beheading spree. But before all that drama, Catherine had already lived a life that reads like a dynastic instruction manual titled How to Marry Your Cousins and Lose Everything. Anyway, Catherine was born in 1485, the youngest daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, the same power couple we met earlier when Joanna the Mad was crying into her embroidery. Catherine was the afterthought baby, born right around the time Spain was finishing up its Reconquista and evicting the last Muslim rulers from Granada. So she entered the world at a triumphant, bloody moment, her parents now the united Catholic monarchs, their children purebred dynastic gold. Now, let's take a peek at that family tree, shall we? Her parents were second cousins, part of the Trastamara dynasty that had already been intermarrying with each other, and with various branches of French, Portuguese and Burgundian nobility. That meant Catherine had Habsburg blood on both sides, as well as Plantagenet blood through earlier generations. Her double cousin status wasn't some weird exception, it was practically a feature. In fact, Catherine was pre-packaged for royal marriage. Bilingual, pious, educated, and genetically engineered to match up with every major ruling house in Europe. At just 3 years old, she was promised to Arthur, Prince of Wales, son of Henry VII of England. By age 15, she was shipped off to a cold Tudor court with her dowry, her ladies-in-waiting, and more Spanish lace than an entire convent. The wedding happened in 1501, a grand ceremony that was equal parts diplomatic showcase and political insurance. Arthur was the future king, and Catherine, his Spanish bride, was expected to sew Spain and England together at the hip. A few days after the wedding, they were reportedly sent to bed with enough ceremony to fill a novel. The court watched them climb into bed together, then left the couple alone to begin what everyone assumed would be a long and fertile partnership. And then Arthur died. 5 months into the marriage, he was gone, possibly from the sweating sickness, possibly tuberculosis. Suddenly the grand plan unravelled. Catherine was left stranded in England, her dowry only partially paid, her future unclear, and her virginity under suspicious review. You see, whether or not she and Arthur had actually consummated their marriage would become the hottest theological debate in Europe 2 decades later, but at the time it was just humiliating. Still, the dynastic wheels kept turning. Within a year, Henry VII proposed a new plan. Catherine would marry Arthur's younger brother, Henry, who would one day become that Henry. There was one little problem: marrying your dead husband's brother against church law. No big deal though, because Catherine swore up and down the marriage was never consummated, and Pope Julius II granted a papal dispensation. The wedding wouldn't happen until 1509, after Henry VII died, and young, athletic golden boy Henry VIII ascended the throne. And for a while it seemed like everything was going to be fine. Catherine was Queen of England, adored by the people, fluent in Latin, devoted to religion, and often more politically savvy than her husband. She even served as regent while Henry was off playing soldier in France, and managed to pull off a stunning victory against the Scots at the Battle of Flodden. But beneath the pearls and courtly dances, the dynasty's foundation was already cracking. Catherine's pregnancies were a tragedy in slow motion. She was pregnant at least 6 times. Only one child, Mary, survived. The rest, boys and girls, were still born, died shortly after birth or miscarried. The pressure was immense and everyone wanted a male heir. Henry, once smitten, grew bitter and paranoid. The court started whispering. Was the Queen cursed? Was God punishing them for the technically incestuous marriage? And here's where the genetics rear their well-documented, scientifically recognised head. Catherine's own maternal grandparents were both from the Trastamara line, meaning her parents were not just cousins, they were part of a lineage that had looped in on itself for generations. Some researchers today believe that the repeated infant deaths may have stemmed from a genetic incompatibility between her and Henry, a hypothesis that involves what's called Kell alloimmunization. If true, it would mean Catherine carried a blood antigen that caused her body to attack fetal red blood cells after the first successful pregnancy. A cruel twist of biology passed down from centuries of noble cousin matching. But back then no one could name it. They just saw failure, and failure in a queen always ends badly. By 1525, Henry had fixated on Anne Boleyn. Catherine was pushed aside, stripped of her titles and confined. She refused to agree to an annulment, insisting she was Henry's lawful wife and queen. This wasn't just personal, it was spiritual. Catherine believed, to the bitter end, that her marriage had been holy, her role ordained by God, and her daughter Mary the rightful heir. Her refusal sparked the English Reformation. Henry broke from the Catholic Church, dissolved the monasteries, and launched a religious war that would split England for generations, all because one queen wouldn't lie about a marriage she'd been forced into at 15. A quirky fact about Catherine: she was a total bookworm. Fluent in Latin and Spanish, she often translated religious texts and was a known patron of humanist scholars. Erasmus of Rotterdam, yes, that Erasmus, once praised her intellect. And when she was confined at Kimbolton Castle in her final years, she reportedly spent her days in prayer, embroidery and letter writing. Her last letter to Henry addressed him not as a tyrant or betrayer, but as my most dear lord and husband, which, yeah, that's either devotion on a saintly level or the final note in a lifetime of royal gaslighting. Scholars still argue whether Catherine's miscarriages were purely bad luck or symptoms of deeper genetic issues, but what's undeniable is how her life, like so many royal women, was shaped and ultimately shattered by a family tree too bent to stand straight. She was the product of dynasties that believed in the divine right of kings and the divine necessity of cousins, and in the end, all that purity of blood couldn't save her. Next we'll meet Isabella of Portugal, Catherine's niece and the empress who married her own double first cousin, producing a son whose chin and destiny would both go down in history. You find yourself now in a golden sunlit hall in Toledo, somewhere between the glow of power and the Sonnenborn and the long shadow of legacy. Tapestries rustle in a breeze that smells faintly of incense and dried roses. At the head of this hall stands a woman draped in regal silence, Isabella of Portugal. If Catherine of Aragon had the stubborn defiance of a queen wronged, Isabella has the heavy poise of one born knowing exactly what's expected and exactly how it's going to hurt. Because Isabella didn't just marry a cousin, she married her double first cousin. That's a genetic term, yes, and a very real nightmare, especially when you're carrying the weight of 2 dynasties on your spine and producing an heir becomes the one job you're not allowed to mess up. Let's pull apart that relationship for a moment. Isabella's father was King Manuel of Fierces of Portugal. Her mother was Maria of Aragon, the sister of Catherine of Aragon. So Isabella was a product of both the Aviz line of Portugal and the Trastamara line of Spain. 2 royal houses already deeply entangled through years of intermarriage. When she married Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, the bloodline loop sealed tight. Charles wasn't just her cousin once over, he was her cousin twice from both sides of the family. You could practically hear their chromosomes groan when they exchanged vows. But in true imperial fashion, the marriage was pitched as a triumph. Charles V was the most powerful monarch in Europe at the time, ruling over not just Spain but huge swathes of Italy, Germany, the Low Countries and the Americas. And Isabella? She was the purest blood match available. Their wedding in 1526 was grand, even by Habsburg standards. Dancing, music, elaborate feasting, and political congratulations disguised as poetry. Historians have noted that Charles genuinely loved Isabella. In fact, he was unusually faithful by royal standards. He even missed her when he went off on his frequent imperial errands, which, let's be honest, is more than most kings of the period could say. Still, love doesn't undo DNA. Isabella and Charles had 7 children, but only 3 survived to adulthood. Among those was Philip II of Spain. Yes, the gloomy Catholic king who later married Mary Tudor and went on to make England very nervous. Philip would inherit not just his father's empire, but his mother's deeply saturated royal blood. And, as with so many dynastic lineages, it showed. But more on that soon. Isabella herself was described as intelligent, composed, and deeply pious. She was fluent in Latin and took her role as empress seriously. While Charles was away fighting Protestants or reorganising his vast empire, Isabella served as regent in Spain, overseeing trade, taxes, military provisioning and all the other joys of early modern bureaucracy. Letters between her and Charles reveal an administrative partnership as much as a romantic one. She wrote about provincial uprisings, grain prices, and the latest news from the Americas, with all the precision of a modern chief of staff. But her reign wasn't all ledgers and letters. Behind the polished court surface, Isabella was plagued by anxiety and health issues. Like many women in her family, she suffered through multiple pregnancies, several of them ending in stillbirth. And though it's not documented in clinical language, because this was the 16th century and everything got filed under melancholia, modern historians believe she showed signs of chronic depression, perhaps postpartum, or perhaps inherited from the same bloodlines that made her both a queen and a statistic. There's a particularly eerie moment preserved in court diaries. Isabella, pregnant with what would be her final child, fainted during a religious procession. It was a public event, and the crowd gasped as she collapsed, pale and unconscious, onto the stone steps of a cathedral. She never fully recovered. Less than a year later, in 1539, she died, at the age of 36. The official cause was complications from childbirth, a vague term that could mean anything from hemorrhage to infection to, perhaps, her body just giving out after too much strain. Too many children, too much duty, too little rest. Charles was devastated. He wore black for the rest of his life. He commissioned portraits, sculptures, and even a grand tomb in her honour. But he didn't remarry. For a man who ruled half the known world, that's saying something. He later retired to a monastery and took up clockmaking, which feels very on brand for a man who'd spent his life trying to keep a ticking empire from falling apart. Here's the historical wildcard. Isabella's bloodline, intensely inbred, meticulously preserved, produced Philip II, who then went on to marry his own niece and later his own cousin. The loop didn't just continue, it tightened. One scholar referred to Isabella and Charles's marriage as the turning point from strategy to surrender. From that moment on, the Habsburgs were no longer just intermarrying to strengthen alliances. They were doing it because there were hardly any outsiders left who matched their standards of royal purity. Now here's the quirky twist. Despite the increasingly fragile bodies coming out of this genetic funnel, the Habsburgs kept winning. Empires expanded. Gold flowed from the Americas. Enemies were crushed. There's a strange tension in Isabella's story between this visible triumph and invisible decline. Between a court gilded with silver thread and a body breaking down from too much repetition in the gene code. Was Isabella aware of the danger? Probably not in the way we'd think about it today. Her letters mention illness, stillbirths, headaches, but never genetics. That wasn't a concept yet. The idea that marrying your cousin might doom your children to physical or mental frailty wouldn't enter common discourse until centuries later. And even then, royals would ignore it. But the signs were there, in the haunted eyes of her surviving son, in the funerals she attended for infants who never drew breath, in the silence that followed her own death, as the Spanish court wrapped itself in black and the empire she helped hold together quietly creaked under its own weight. Isabella of Portugal is often overshadowed by louder names: Catherine, Anne, Mary, even Charles. but her story is one of the clearest lenses through which you can view the cost of dynastic ambition. She was everything a queen was supposed to be: noble, obedient, fertile, and ultimately gone too soon. Next, we shift focus north, where Margaret's legacy continues in the Low Countries, and a duchess named Marie of Burgundy tries to escape the trap. But the family tree has other plans. The light shifts now, grows cooler, softer, as we drift north from the sun-scorched courts of Iberia to the lush, damp pastures of Burgundy, where silk banners flap in a colder breeze, and the halls are more Dutch than Spanish, more Flemish than Castilian. You find yourself in the Burgundian Netherlands, that rich, glittering corner of Europe that always seemed to lie just outside the reach of stability. And in the middle of it all, wrapped in furs and political anxiety, stands Marie of Burgundy. If you're hoping for a moment of calm in our parade of inbred royalty, well, not tonight. Marie is another noblewoman tangled in the Habsburg web, and though she tries to claw her way out, fate and family have other plans. Marie was born in 1457, the only child of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, and Isabella of Bourbon. Now, her mother was the daughter of a Bourbon prince and a Valois princess, meaning Marie's family tree had already been bending in on itself like a drunk trying to tie a necktie. Charles the Bold wanted a son, of course he did, but when Marie arrived he immediately began preparing her to rule, and not just symbolically. He raised her to read treaties, interpret military reports, and conduct court rituals with the weight of a sovereign. That was all well and good until he died suddenly in battle at Nancy in 1477, leaving 19-year-old Marie as ruler of one of the richest territories in Europe and unmarried. Cue the political feeding frenzy. France, always circling Burgundy like a hungry wolf, moved fast. King Louis XI wanted Marie to marry his son and take Burgundy with her into French hands. The Low Countries weren't having it. They preferred the Habsburgs. Yes, those charming overlords of cousin marriages and imperial ambition. So the Burgundian nobles made their move. They offered Marie's hand to Maximilian of Austria, son of Emperor Frederick III. And yes, if that name sounds familiar, it should. That's the same Maximilian who was the son of Eleanor of Portugal and Frederick III, meaning, you guessed it, another round of cousin knots just got added to the pile. Marie, to her credit, wasn't all that thrilled about the idea. She'd been educated to rule, not just to serve. She reportedly delayed the marriage negotiations, insisting on favourable terms. And in a rare medieval flex, she also issued the Great Privilege, a document that gave significant power to the local provinces in exchange for their support. That wasn't just politics, it was rebellion against the centralised royal control that her suitors, especially the French and Habsburgs, preferred. But in the end, the dynastic machine won. She married Maximilian in 1477, and with that marriage, the Habsburgs inherited the entire Burgundian inheritance, a prize that would define European politics for the next century. Now here's the part where the gene pool starts bubbling ominously. Marie and Maximilian were distant cousins, connected through generations of Valois and Habsburg unions. Their children, therefore, were a perfect blend of French, Burgundian, Austrian and Iberian royal blood, none of which had ever spent much time outside the family circle. Their son Philip the Handsome would later marry Joanna the Mad of Castile, which we've already covered in all its emotionally volatile glory. So yes, Marie of Burgundy is technically the great-grandmother of Charles V and one of the key contributors to the now infamous Habsburg jaw. But Marie didn't live long enough to see what her bloodline would become. She died in 1482, just 5 years after her wedding, in a tragic horse-riding accident. She was out hunting, a proper noble pastime, when her horse slipped on the muddy road and fell on top of her. Her back was crushed. She lingered in agony for several days before dying at the age of 25. The court went into mourning, Maximilian wept, and Europe once again found itself with a power vacuum shaped like a young woman. Here's the quirky detail. Marie was buried in Bruges, and her tomb remains one of the most visited sites in the city. But during a renovation in the 20th century, archaeologists opened the tomb and found her remarkably well-preserved skeleton, complete with a visible injury to the spine exactly where chroniclers described her accident. It's one of those eerie moments where legend and osteology meet under fluorescent lighting. So what do scholars make of Marie's role in the genetic arc of Europe? Some view her as a pivotal figure, not just a dynastic match, but the critical hinge that swung the Burgundian legacy toward the Habsburgs. Without Marie, there's no Charles V, no global empire, and possibly no grotesque accumulation of cousin-coded chromosomes. Others focus on her lost potential. As an educated, politically active young woman, she might have ruled Burgundy as an independent duchess, an alternative history where the Low Countries become their own powerhouse instead of yet another Habsburg annex. But history doesn't deal in what-ifs. Marie married the right man at the wrong time and died before she could shape her legacy. And that legacy ultimately became her descendants, long-faced, melancholic, sometimes brilliant, sometimes broken, but always bound to the throne by blood too thick to breathe freely. One final thought. Marie tried, in her brief rule, to decentralise power, to give voice to her people, and to resist the dynastic stranglehold of her time. But even her resistance became a tool of the empire. Her blood, her body and her banner all ended up under Habsburg control. It's the ultimate medieval irony. The more she tried to escape the family knot, the tighter it pulled around her. Next we head back into the heart of that knot and meet Anna of Austria, a woman who married her own nephew, and somehow didn't even make the top 3 weirdest Habsburg unions. Yeah, it's about to get darker. The air thickens as we travel now to late 16th century Spain, a time when candles flickered against stone walls already haunted by portraits with too many identical faces. Welcome to the court of Philip II, where the inbreeding isn't just an unfortunate footnote, it's the main feature. And here, standing quietly in a velvet gown that probably weighed more than a grown dog, is Anna of Austria. She's serene, devout, obedient, exactly what the Spanish court wanted in a queen. But behind that placid mask is a truth so twisted you could use it as a puzzle in a genetics class. Because Anna didn't just marry her cousin, she married her uncle, her actual biological uncle. That's right, she was 17, he was her mother's brother, and their shared genes could have won a family reunion bingo game in one turn. Anna of Austria was born in 1549, daughter of Maximilian II, Holy Roman Emperor, and Maria of Spain. Maria, in turn, was the sister of Philip making Anna both his niece and, thanks to the Habsburgs' ongoing commitment to the family circle, already his cousin through multiple other lines. If you're trying to keep track, just imagine their family tree as a plate of spaghetti, where every noodle touches every other noodle, and someone spilled holy oil on it. At the time of their engagement, Philip II was already on his 4th marriage attempt. His first wife was Maria Manuela of Portugal, his double first cousin. Then came Mary I of England, also his cousin. Then Elizabeth of Valois, again a cousin. And now his teenage niece Anna. By this point the Habsburgs had stopped bothering to look outside the family. They'd seen what happened when bloodlines got too mixed. Claims weakened, borders blurred, alliances frayed. Better to just keep it in the family, even if that family was starting to look like a set of nesting dolls with the same face. Their marriage took place in 1570. Philip was 43, Anna was 17. The age gap was considered completely normal. What wasn't normal, even by 16th century standards, was how closely related they were. The Pope had to grant a special papal dispensation, one that raised more than a few eyebrows in Rome, but the political necessity overrode religious awkwardness. Philip needed a fertile wife to produce a male heir, his previous attempts hadn't gone well, and Anna came with the best breeding credentials possible. Pure Habsburg blood, extreme piety, and a womb unburdened by other dynastic alliances. So how did this deeply incestuous union work out? Surprisingly, not terribly, at least in the short term. Anna was reportedly kind, patient, and genuinely liked her husband. He in turn seems to have adored her in his own sombre, tightly wound way. Unlike his previous marriages, this one was relatively peaceful. No public arguments, no scandal. She played her role as queen perfectly. Reserved in public, devoutly Catholic, endlessly maternal. She gave birth to 5 children in rapid succession, 4 of whom survived infancy, another Habsburg miracle. One of those children was Philip III of Spain, who would eventually succeed his father. But while Anna herself seemed to weather the biological risks of close inbreeding better than some of her predecessors, the genetic toll was quietly accruing in her children. Philip III, her most famous son, grew up listless, indecisive, and deeply reliant on court favourites to govern. While not physically deformed like his own son would later be, many scholars note the intellectual and emotional decline that began with this generation. He was smart enough to stay out of wars, but too passive to lead an empire. His reliance on court favourites like the Duke of Lerma led to widespread corruption and the slow decline of Spanish global influence. It was the beginning of a quiet unravelling, and Anna's genes were part of the recipe. Here's a fringe medical fact. Some researchers believe that the accumulation of recessive genes from repeated uncle-niece marriages in the Habsburg line contributed to something called mandibular prognathism, aka the infamous Habsburg jaw. Anna's children showed early signs of this condition, but it would fully blossom in her grandson Charles II, whose jaw was so oversized he couldn't chew food properly. That's where we're heading. For Anna, she was still in the early stages of the Habsburg decline, symptoms beginning to appear, but not yet catastrophic. She died in 1580, just shy of her 31st birthday. The cause? Complications from childbirth, which, given the rate at which she was expected to produce heirs, is hardly surprising. Philip was devastated. For a man so emotionally buttoned up, his grief was palpable. He reportedly locked himself away for weeks, wore mourning clothes for the rest of his life, and never remarried. Some even say he kept her portrait beside him at all times, whispering prayers into the canvas. A tragically romantic detail, or a sign that the man had finally realised what his dynasty had cost him. A quirky footnote. Anna was obsessed with relics and holy tokens. She collected saints' bones, fragments of robes, and splinters of what was supposedly the true cross. Her private chapel looked less like a royal sanctuary, and more like a medieval medical museum. Was it a symptom of her devout upbringing, or maybe just a coping mechanism for a life that required daily denial of personal choice? Historians today still debate whether Anna knew the full scope of her genetic connection to Philip when she married him. It's hard to believe she didn't. But then again, in her world, marrying your uncle wasn't scandalous. It was practical. It meant staying within the Habsburg brand, keeping outsiders out, and in ensuring the purity of the royal line. A purity that came at the cost of physical health, mental acuity, and, for many women like Anna, their lives. She wasn't flamboyant or rebellious or particularly outspoken, but Anna of Austria might just be the most quietly dangerous woman in this entire dynasty. Because from her womb came a generation that looked perfect on paper and hollow beneath the surface. Next up we meet Juana of Austria, Anna's sister-in-law and one of the rare royal women who actually ruled in her own name. But even she couldn't outrun the family's shadow, or its genes. You wake up now in a Spanish court wrapped in sombre elegance, black silks, ivory beads, and incense-soaked corridors where politics and piety dance in practiced silence. Here walks Juana of Austria, tall, composed and brilliant. She glides through the halls like someone raised not only among royalty but as royalty, the kind of woman who bows to no one unless the optics require it. Unlike many of her predecessors, Juana isn't just another dynastic pawn shuffled into marriage and early death. She's something rarer, a Habsburg woman trusted to rule. But don't let that fool you into thinking she escaped the family curse. Her pedigree is as pure and as twisted as a pretzel dipped in holy water. Born in 1535, Juana was the daughter of Charles V and Isabella of Portugal. Yes, those two, the double first cousins from Section 8. So right from birth, her bloodline was tighter than a sealed tomb. But physically, Juana seemed to dodge the worst of the Habsburg deformities. No jawbone you could hang a curtain rod from, no reported limp, no debilitating disease. Instead, she inherited her father's cool intellect and her mother's quiet strength. That said, when both your parents are from the same set of grandparents twice over, you don't exactly get a clean slate. You get a loaded dice roll. Her childhood was cloaked in velvet and protocol. She was raised alongside her brother, Philip II, and a rotating cast of aunts, tutors and religious advisors who filled her head with languages, theology and statecraft. She spoke Latin, French and Castilian fluently by her teens and could hold her own in debates with bishops. Erasmus, if he'd still been alive, would have given her a slow clap. Now here's where her story veers off the usual track. At just 17, Juana was married to Prince João Manuel of Portugal, her first cousin. Not just your run-of-the-mill cousin either. This was a solid intermarriage between two dynasties that had already been trading genes like medieval Pokemon cards. João's health wasn't great. He had that ghostly glow you only get from generations of not-so-genetic diversity. And sure enough, less than 2 years into the marriage, he died of what's generally believed to be tuberculosis, or some other inbred immunity failure. Juana was left a widow at 19, but wait, it gets better. She was also pregnant. The child, a boy, was born shortly after João's death and named Sebastian. He would later become King of Portugal, and if you're imagining a strong virile monarch ready to lead his people to glory, hold that thought. Sebastian was raised by priests, grew obsessed with crusading, and died in North Africa at 24, launching a succession crisis that would hand Portugal to Spain. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Back to Juana. After her husband's death, the Portuguese court wanted her to stay and raise the new heir. Juana said absolutely not. She returned to Spain, without her son, mind you, and resumed life at her brother's court. And here's where she pulls off the Habsburg equivalent of a power move. Philip II appointed her regent of Spain while he travelled to England to marry Queen Mary. That's right, Juana of Austria ruling Spain in her brother's name. Not as a placeholder, not as a puppet. She governed for several years, overseeing finance, military matters, and diplomacy with the same authority a king would wield. And she did it with grace and very few public missteps. This was nearly unprecedented. Medieval and Renaissance courts were not exactly feminist havens. But Juana defied the norms. Even as she operated within a system built to exclude her, she knew how to speak its language, how to use its symbols, and when to stand absolutely still and let others collapse under their own weight. Of course, no Habsburg woman gets a totally clean ride. After her regency, Juana retired to a convent in Madrid, not out of a sudden fit of piety, but by her own calculated choice. She became a nun, yes, but also the convent's founder and spiritual director. The convent of Las Descalzas Reales, still standing today, was her kingdom in miniature, filled with art, relics, and silent power. She never remarried. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe she didn't want to. Scholars still debate whether her retreat to religious life was genuine devotion or a socially acceptable way to avoid becoming another pawn in the dynastic marriage game. Now, let's talk about her son again. Sebastian grew up in Portugal under his grandmother's care and a battalion of Jesuit tutors. Reports from his youth suggest he was pious, stiff, and disturbingly single-minded. No marriage, no heirs, just endless sermons about war and purity. When he finally launched his disastrous campaign into Morocco, many suspected he was trying to live out the holy war fantasies fed to him in childhood. He died in battle, his body never recovered. Portugal spiralled into political chaos, and the Spanish crown under Juana's brother Philip II claimed it. Juana never saw her son again after she left Portugal. She never returned for him. Whether that haunts her, we'll never know. Here's your quirky historical footnote. Juana had a reputation for never raising her voice. In a court filled with loud men shouting about lineage and honour, Juana whispered and got her way. There's an anecdote, possibly apocryphal, that during a tense council meeting she silenced a room of bickering ministers with a single raised eyebrow. That's the kind of queen energy we can all aspire to. So what's the scholarly debate around Juana? Some argue she was the last clean Habsburg, a woman who somehow avoided the worst physical and mental effects of inbreeding. Others think her health was the exception that proved the rule, a statistical blip in an otherwise steady decline. A few point to her decision to separate from her child and say she was cold, detached. Others see it as strategic genius, avoiding Portuguese court politics and securing her own power base. What's certain is that Juana of Austria was one of the most capable women of her dynasty, possibly of her entire century. But even she couldn't stop what was coming. Her genes, passed down through Sebastian, would play their part in ending Portugal's independence. And the careful dynastic legacy she helped maintain, it would become the very thing that unravelled it all. Next up, we enter the Spanish Netherlands to meet Isabella Clara Eugenia, the Habsburg princess who ruled with clarity and charisma and still carried the same tightly wound DNA spiral in every cell of her being. You find yourself now in the echoing corridors of a palace in the Spanish Netherlands, where the scent of beeswax, incense and northern chill lingers in the stone. The tapestries are thick, the windows tall and solemn, and in the centre of it all is a woman dressed in black velvet, her hair tucked beneath a lace veil, her face composed like a carved cameo. This is Isabella Clara Eugenia, daughter of Philip VI and Anna of Austria, product of uncle-niece marriage, great-granddaughter of double first cousins, and one of the last truly functional members of a dynasty straining under the weight of its own blood. Born in 1566, Isabella was, genetically speaking, already a miracle for being relatively healthy. Her parents, as you'll recall, were so closely related that they probably shared more DNA than any married couple should. even by medieval standards. And yet here came Isabella, intelligent, steady and eerily competent. She was raised in the heart of the Spanish court, fluent in Latin, French and Italian, by the time most children were still struggling with prayers. Her education was serious: rhetoric, theology, diplomacy. She wasn't being trained to be a consort. She was being trained to rule. At first, her future seemed to rest on the marital merry-go-round. Several possible suitors were dangled, including no less than the ageing widower King James VI of Scotland, and, briefly, hilariously, Emperor Rudolph II, who was also her cousin and arguably already unravelling mentally when the proposal was floated. But her father, Philip II, kept stalling. He was deeply attached to Isabella, and there are strong hints that he simply couldn't bear to give her away. She remained unmarried until she was over 30, which, in royal terms, was practically a nun's age. It wasn't until Philip needed to stabilise the fracturing Netherlands that he made his move. In 1598, Philip did something radical. He granted Isabella and her new husband, Archduke Albert of Austria, joint sovereignty over the Spanish Netherlands. That's right, he gave her an actual throne, not a decorative title, not a temporary regency, real power, with real autonomy. The catch? Albert was also her cousin, of course, and their marriage was arranged more for political optics than romance. But as royal marriages go, theirs was weirdly successful. They shared a calm respect and a common goal: bring peace to a region shredded by decades of Protestant rebellion and war. Isabella arrived in the Low Countries like a small royal storm cloud, dressed in black, flanked by advisors, and carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent a lifetime watching her father crush heretics and govern an empire. But she also brought something surprising: pragmatism. While Albert led the armies, Isabella worked the court. She restored cities, mediated religious tension, and charmed the nobility into cautious loyalty. The region was still a mess, but she managed to hold the centre. And she wasn't just a ruler in name. Contemporary letters describe her as meticulous, detail-obsessed, and deeply engaged in state matters. She would rise before dawn, attend mass, and then spend the rest of the day dictating correspondence, reviewing finances, and receiving ambassadors. One account describes her personally correcting a shipment of wool tariffs, while a priest nervously tried to get her to stop working and pray. Later, she reportedly said, the flock must be fed. Despite all this, Isabella never had children. Whether by choice or misfortune is unclear. Some speculate that Albert, her cousin husband, may have been infertile due to their mutual family inbreeding. Others suggest a miscarriage or two, hidden by court silence. What's notable is that neither seemed too concerned with producing an heir. They had each other, and they had work to do. It's oddly refreshing. Two Habsburgs in a functioning relationship that wasn't built solely around uterine expectations, but the curse of the dynasty always lingers. After Albert died in 1621, Isabella took religious vows and officially became a nun. But let's be honest, she was a nun in the same way a CEO might become emeritus. She kept her title, her influence, and her schedule. She just wore more black and talked more about God. In many ways, her post-widowhood rule was even more effective. She held the Netherlands together through factional sniping, external pressure, and the slow encroachment of war. Here's the quirky detail. Isabella loved theatre, not just in a royal patron kind of way. She personally reviewed scripts, attended rehearsals, and even acted in morality plays when she was younger. One courtier recorded watching her perform a scene as the Virgin Mary, noting that she delivered her lines with such precision it seemed more sermon than drama. Honestly, it sounds like she could have had a solid career in the arts if she hadn't been born into one of Europe's most overbred families. Now, the scholarly debate. Was Isabella Clara Eugenia the last competent Habsburg? Some historians argue yes. She's seen as the final bright flicker before the dynasty descended into mental instability and physical deformity. Others argue she benefited from circumstance. She ruled a smaller territory during a relative lull in European chaos, and with a husband who shared power. Either way, she made an impression. While other Habsburg women were remembered for their deaths, their wombs, or their madness, Isabella was remembered for her leadership. She died in 1633 at the age of 66, a shockingly long life for a Habsburg woman. Her funeral in Brussels was a major event, attended by nobles, priests, artists, and commoners alike. She left behind no children, but a political legacy strong enough to be remembered centuries later. And for once, that legacy wasn't about how crooked her jaw was or how many cousins she married. Isabella Clara Eugenia is proof that even in the middle of a genetic swamp, a single candle can burn steadily. She wasn't loud, she wasn't dramatic, but she ruled, she led, and she managed to carry the unbearable weight of Habsburg inheritance with something that looked a lot like grace. Next we travel to Versailles, where another branch of the family tree unravels in powdered wigs and satin corsets, starting with Maria Theresa of Spain, whose Bourbon cousins were waiting with open arms and open marriage licenses. Let the echo of cobblestone horses and rustling satin lead you now into the golden corridors of Versailles, where mirrors stretch endlessly and the smell of rosewater clings to every breath. Here we find Maria Theresa of Spain, standing beneath a ceiling painted with gods she probably no longer believed in. She's surrounded by chandeliers, gilded mouldings, and a court more obsessed with appearance than any in Europe's long, gaudy history. But Maria Theresa is not just another queen in a corset. She is the living product of centuries of Habsburg intermarriage, carefully wrapped in taffeta and shipped north to become the wife of King Louis XIV of France, who also happens to be her double cousin. Born in 1638, Maria Theresa was the daughter of King Philip IV of Spain and Elizabeth of France. And already that's a red flag. Her parents were first cousins, her grandparents were first cousins, and her great-grandparents, you guessed it, also cousins. At this point, the Habsburg family wasn't just inbred, they were aggressively recycling their gene pool like a medieval eco-initiative gone horribly wrong. So when Maria Theresa entered the world, her destiny was already shackled to the idea of preserving this legacy, no matter the cost. She grew up in the rigid, sorrow-tinged court of Spain, surrounded by Catholic solemnity, funerary black clothing, and enough incense to fog up every memory. Her education was strictly religious, heavy on saints, light on strategy. She was taught to be obedient, chaste and silent, with the occasional music lesson thrown in to soften the edges. And then came the War of the Spanish Succession, followed by peace negotiations. France and Spain needed to seal the deal with a marriage, and Maria Theresa, only 20, untested and thoroughly Habsburg, was offered as the gift. Louis XIV, the Sun King, was everything her court was not. Flashy, confident, secular in a dangerous way, and drenched in power. He reportedly took one look at Maria Theresa and said, "She is the Infanta of Spain," which was either a compliment or a gentle acknowledgement that her reputation preceded her, like a politely coughing ghost. Their marriage was arranged with urgency. France wanted peace, Spain wanted dignity. The wedding took place in 1660 on the border between their kingdoms, and it included one of the most famous gestures in diplomatic history. Louis met Maria Theresa on a small island in the middle of a river, neutral territory, and took her hand with a smile that masked 20 layers of political calculation. From the start it was a mismatch. Maria Theresa was gentle, sheltered and painfully pious. Louis was worldly, calculating and frankly busy chasing his mistress. He had a string of lovers before and after the wedding, and his court was a dizzying place full of intrigue, coded glances and powdered whispers. Maria Theresa wasn't built for this. She tried though, she smiled when required, bore Louis 6 children though only one survived, and tried to navigate the court of Versailles without falling apart. But behind her jewelled eyes was a woman slowly unravelling from the inside out. Her Habsburg heritage wasn't just a footnote, it was visible. Portraits show her with the soft jawline and slightly receding chin that marked her as royal stock from the Spanish side. She was small, often unwell, and prone to what doctors at the time politely called nervous spells, fainting, headaches, periods of withdrawn silence that lasted for days. Today many suspect she suffered from chronic migraines, likely aggravated by the inbreeding and the constant stress of being an outsider in one of Europe's most judgmental courts. And let's not ignore the worst part, the children. Maria Theresa had 6, but only one, the Dauphin Louis, lived past childhood. The rest died of illness, often within months or even days of birth. The Bourbon line, though more genetically diverse than the Spanish Habsburgs, still bore the weight of that mingled blood. The child losses devastated her, though she rarely showed it in public. Louis, in contrast, moved on with the emotional elasticity of a man whose kingdom was always his first love. A quirky footnote. Maria Theresa had a fierce love for chocolate. Spain had introduced it to Europe, and she brought her habit with her to France. She reportedly drank thick, hot chocolate every morning, often seasoned with cinnamon and vanilla, though some blamed her frequent migraines on it. You can imagine her sitting in her velvet chambers, sipping from a porcelain cup, trying not to cry while court ladies whispered about the king's latest mistress just down the hall. The scholarly debate around Maria Theresa is more psychological than political. Was she simply too weak for the French court? Or was she a woman broken by years of silent trauma, cultural alienation, and the pressure to produce heirs when her body, burdened by generations of cousin pairing, was no longer capable? Historians argue over whether she was complicit in her own marginalisation or merely surviving in a system that never gave her a chance. What's certain is that Maria Theresa never fully integrated. She remained to the end the Spanish queen. Louis respected her position, but not her person. When she died in 1683, reportedly from complications of an abscessed arm, Louis declared, "This is the first time she has caused me pain." Which, wow, that's either devastating or just the cruelest eulogy ever delivered in a silk-lined hallway. But in true royal fashion, her legacy outlived her body. Her son, the Grand Dauphin, would carry forward the Bourbon line. And through a twisted game of political dominoes, Maria Theresa's descendants would eventually sit on the Spanish throne, uniting the Bourbon and Habsburg bloodlines once more, because apparently Europe hadn't had quite enough of that yet. So here lies Maria Theresa of Spain, a queen in France, a stranger in her own life, a woman whose body became the shaky bridge between two empires, and whose silence screamed across centuries. Her death marked a turning point. Versailles would become even more theatrical, Spain even more fragile, and the dynasty even more doomed. Next, we tiptoe back into France, where her daughter-in-law Elizabeth of Valois married into the same bloodline from the other side, bringing a new French twist to this increasingly inescapable loop of royalty, religion, and family resemblance. Now we step back slightly in time, but not out of the genetic maze, as we move toward a figure who seems, at first glance, like a breath of fresh air in an otherwise stagnant bloodline. Elizabeth of Valois, daughter of France, Queen of Spain, and yet another woman whose royal marriage was less about romance and more about patching together crumbling dynasties with the human equivalent of genetic duct tape. She walked into Philip II's Spanish court with a flush of youthful beauty and a soft Parisian grace, only to find herself trapped inside one of the most brittle, inbred bloodlines Europe had to offer. And surprise, she was marrying her cousin, again. Born in 1545, Elizabeth was the eldest daughter of King Henry VII of France and Catherine de' Medici, a woman infamous in her own right for political manipulation, questionable poisons, and an unfortunate nose for disaster. But Elizabeth was her golden child, intelligent, well-mannered, fluent in Spanish, and painted in a flattering light from an early age. Her destiny, like that of all princesses in this strange, glittering game, was decided not by passional choice, but by treaties and territorial anxieties. Specifically, the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis, which ended a long series of wars between France and Spain, sealed her fate. The treaty required a marriage to cement the peace, and Elizabeth, just 13 years old, was handed over to King Philip II of Spain. You may remember him. He's the guy who married his niece, Anna of Austria, later on. But Elizabeth was wife number 3, the one wed to him while he was still only 32 and still actively collecting cousins. At the time of their marriage in 1559, Elizabeth was 14, and the age gap, while not unheard of, was steep even by royal standards. More than that, the difference in personality was even steeper. Philip was reserved, austere and brooding, raised in the shadow of his Habsburg heritage and the religious obligation. Elizabeth, by contrast, had grown up in the vibrant, almost chaotic court of France, surrounded by artists, jesters, and that walking paradox of a mother, Catherine de' Medici. She came to Spain full of life, curious about her new world. Spain, however, was not interested in being charmed. Life at the Spanish court was governed by solemnity. Black garments, endless protocol, long masses, silence as a virtue. Elizabeth found it stifling, and Philip found her youthful energy both fascinating and mildly inconvenient. But to his credit, he came to genuinely care for her. She was his political bride, yes, but he grew attached to her delicate intelligence and quiet strength. Their relationship, unlike many in this dynasty, bloomed gently into mutual affection. Still, the expectations were enormous. Elizabeth was supposed to provide a male heir, something the Spanish crown was always desperate for, especially given the high mortality rate of royal infants and the increasingly fragile genetic lottery. Over the next few years, she endured several pregnancies, and here's where history gets hazy. Some say she miscarried repeatedly. Others report she had 2 daughters and then a series of tragic losses. But all agree that her final pregnancy in 1568 ended in her death at just 23 years old, likely from a ruptured uterus. Yes, 23. It's a brutal pattern now. Teenage brides, cousin marriages, a few fleeting moments of peace, and then a quiet death in childbirth while the court whispers about divine punishment or inherited curses. A quirky fact. Elizabeth was a voracious reader and kept a personal library in her Spanish chambers. She insisted that her books be in both French and Spanish, which was considered mildly rebellious at the time. One court lady wrote that the Queen spent more time with pages than with pearls, and while that was probably intended as a slight, it now reads like a badge of honour. Now let's pause and run the genetics. Elizabeth's father, Henry II, came from the Valois line, which had already begun intermingling with the Habsburgs through various cousins and strategic alliances. Her mother, Catherine de' Medici, was from the Medici family of Florence, a line not particularly known for inbreeding, but heavy on heart disease and toxic ambition. When Elizabeth married Philip II, she added a burst of French DNA to the Spanish court, but not enough to dilute the heavy Habsburg stock. Their daughters, Isabella Clara Eugenia and Catalina Michaela, would carry these combined lines forward, Isabella especially, whom we just met in the last section. What do scholars argue about when it comes to Elizabeth? Some see her as a mere figurehead, a victim of early death and tragic expectations. Others see her as a quietly subversive figure, someone who brought French flair and feminine diplomacy into a court that needed both. She was reportedly popular with the Spanish people, though she never wielded formal power. Still, in a place where queens were expected to be silent wombs, Elizabeth's gentle intellect made more of a mark than many noticed at the time. And yet, for all her grace, she left behind the same painful legacy as the rest. A royal lineage more focused on purity than health, more devoted to inheritance than vitality. Her children were raised with the same rigid expectations, the same constant pressure to marry within the family, and the same blind trust that God would sort out the chromosomes. Spoiler, he did not. The irony? Elizabeth was actually first betrothed to Don Carlos, Philip's unstable son from an earlier marriage, but that plan was nixed when everyone realised Carlos was, let's say, unwell. Violently paranoid, erratic, and ultimately imprisoned by his own father. So Elizabeth got the father instead of the son, dodging one nightmare but stepping into another slow unravelling. So here lies Elizabeth of Valois, too young to fight, too smart to be forgotten, and too entangled in a genetic and political web to ever escape. A queen who brought colour to a court painted only in grey, and who in the end became another soft-voiced casualty of a dynasty that prized bloodlines over lives. Next, we'll journey to a lesser-known figure, Barbara of Austria, a woman who, unlike most of her relatives, tried to steer her own ship, even as the tide of family expectations threatened to pull her under. Now we drift quietly eastward, away from the golden glare of Versailles and the incense-drenched gloom of Spain, and find ourselves in Central Europe, where the courts are colder, the politics more tangled, and the family trees just as knotted. Tonight's chapter belongs to Barbara of Austria, a woman most people have never heard of, and yet she ticks every box in the Habsburg dynasty's long-running checklist. Noble birth, cousin to marriage, strategic deployment, and a life spent smiling through expectations she never really asked for. But Barbara is the different kind of Habsburg, subtler, slyer, and quietly rebellious in the ways that mattered. Born in 1539, Barbara was the daughter of Ferdinand I, Holy Roman Emperor, and Anna of Bohemia and Hungary. Her parents were, say it with me now, cousins, and her bloodline was as royal as they come, dense with titles and thick with all the usual genetic baggage, nervous ailments, narrow jaws, and a family history of illnesses that no one in the court dared to diagnose honestly. Still, Barbara came into the world with advantages. She was raised in Vienna, in a court buzzing with scholars, musicians, and diplomats. She spoke multiple languages by adolescence, was devout in that uniquely Habsburg Catholic way, and, according to at least one ambassador, had eyes that knew known things. By the time she reached marriageable age, which, surprise, was somewhere around 14, Barbara was being quietly shopped around to various relatives and allied royals. She was eventually married off to Alfonso II d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, a nobleman from one of Italy's most prestigious houses, but also, yes, a relative. Their union was arranged to strengthen ties between the Holy Roman Empire and northern Italy, but also to keep the Habsburg blood flowing through powerful veins. Alfonso was the son of Ercole d'Este and Renée of France, meaning his ancestry included French, Italian, and, through the usual sideways marriages, Habsburg connections. So, not immediate cousins, but the kind where if you traced it back 3 generations, you'd find a shared great-grandfather hiding in a jewelled tomb somewhere. The marriage took place in 1565, and from the outside it looked like a success. Barbara arrived in Ferrara with a retinue of ladies, priests, and enough embroidery to wrap the Alps. She embraced her duties with poise, patron of the arts, religious benefactor, duchess with a heart of gold, or at least gold leaf. But underneath that polished surface, Barbara was quietly carving out a space for herself. Unlike many of her inbred contemporaries, she wasn't content to just fade behind her husband's shoulder. She refused to be an ornament. She demanded political briefings, managed palace staff with ruthless efficiency, and involved herself in diplomatic correspondence. One Venetian ambassador even called her the whisper behind the throne. And here's the thing. Barbara was smarter than most of the men around her. She knew exactly what the game was, and she played it with velvet gloves and a steel needle hidden beneath. When her husband began favouring courtiers who opposed Habsburg interests, Barbara moved quickly, replacing advisors, writing to her father, and making sure everyone understood that the Duchy of Ferrara was still married to the Empire, in every sense. But even Barbara couldn't escape the Habsburg pattern of suffering in silence. She had health problems from the start, though no one could say exactly what they were. Chronic fatigue, mysterious stomach pains, fainting spells. Her physicians called it a nervous weakness. Today, some historians suspect she may have had early signs of an autoimmune disorder, or a neurological condition, both of which have been linked to inbreeding and appear repeatedly in Habsburg medical records. Others suggest she suffered from a chronic infection, perhaps tuberculosis, which was making the rounds in nearly every royal court at the time. And of course there were the children, or rather, the lack of them. Barbara never had a surviving heir. She reportedly had several miscarriages, and her inability to produce a son was a constant source of quiet court gossip. As always, though, the blame settled squarely on the woman, even though Alfonso was widely rumoured to have his own health issues, including a possible congenital defect that may have rendered him sterile. The irony? In a marriage arranged for genetic power, the genes simply refused to cooperate. Here's a quirky detail to tuck under your pillow. Barbara had a passion for astrology. In an age when science and superstition still dined at the same table, she kept a private astrologer who charted her days, her moods, and her prayers. She reportedly delayed diplomatic meetings if her stars looked unfavourable, and once refused to sign a treaty on a Tuesday because she had a feeling in her chest. Her brother Maximilian, himself no stranger to odd habits, thought it charming. Her husband, not so much. Despite their growing distance, Barbara remained duchess in all the right ways. She funded convents, commissioned altarpieces, and kept the court of Ferrara humming. But her health continued to decline. By 1572, she was bedridden for weeks at a time. In 1572, at just 32 years old, she died, quietly surrounded by the monks, with incense burning and bells tolling the same tired song that had followed generations of Habsburg women before her. Alfonso, in a rare public show of emotion, had a grand tomb constructed for her in the church of Corpus Domini in Ferrara. But within months, he was remarried, this time to another noblewoman from a politically advantageous house. Barbara was mourned, then filed away like so many Habsburg women, used, revered, and promptly forgotten. So what do historians make of her? Some see Barbara as a minor figure, a duchess who never made waves. Others, those who read between the lines, see a woman who understood the game and played it better than most. She wielded influence quietly, took control where she could, and managed to hold on to her dignity in a system designed to erase it. And yes, she died young, childless, and under the shadow of inbreeding. But she also left behind a court more stable than it had been when she arrived, and a legacy of competence wrapped in silence. Barbara of Austria reminds us that not every royal woman screamed her way through history. Some whispered, some manoeuvred, and some, like her, left fingerprints only visible if you know where to look. Next we return to Sicily, where Constance of Aragon shows us that tangled bloodlines were already in fashion long before the Habsburgs made it their whole personality. Now the air thickens again, not with incense or velvet, but with the dry, citrus-salted breeze of medieval Sicily. We're going further back this time, to the 13th century, where Europe is still split into papal loyalties and warring kingdoms, and the word dynasty means more than just who gets which throne. It means who owns the blood that flows between them. Here in Palermo, with its jumble of Norman towers and Moorish gardens, we find Constance of Aragon, a queen whose life was less about being inbred than about being born into a family already spiralling through centuries of it. She's a sort of prequel to everything we've seen, a woman who inherits the prototype for the same tangled dynastic ambitions that would later define the Habsburgs, the Capetians, and everyone else who couldn't keep their rings off their cousins' fingers. Constance was born in 1179 to Alfonso X of Aragon and Sancha of Castile, and yes, her parents were cousins. No surprise there. In fact, both the House of Aragon and the Castilian crown had been intermarrying for generations already. Long before the Habsburgs turned it into an art form, the Iberian royals were blending their family lines into such a smooth puree of shared ancestry that historians still struggle to map it without a whiteboard and several pots of coffee. Constance then entered the world with a bloodline already folding in on itself. She was royal, she was valuable, and she was destined to be traded like an extremely fancy political baseball card. By the time she was in her mid-teens, her future was sealed. She would marry Frederick VI, heir to the Kingdom of Sicily and the Holy Roman Empire. Frederick wasn't just a powerful match, he was a complicated one. His mother, Constance of Sicily, yes, another Constance, tried to keep up, had died shortly after his birth, and his father, Emperor Henry VI, had left him under the protection of the Pope. But as with all royal matches, the politics behind it were more important than the people involved. Marrying Aragon into Sicily, that was strategy. It would give the Aragonese a foothold in Italy, and the Hohenstaufen dynasty, a German royal line, would get a little infusion of Spanish prestige. Their marriage took place in 1209, and Constance was crowned Queen of Sicily shortly after. She was about 30, relatively old for a first-time royal bride, but that gave her an unusual advantage. She wasn't a teenage pawn. She was an adult woman with education, political awareness, and some understanding of the game she was now playing. Frederick, meanwhile, was young, brilliant, and already deeply suspicious of everyone, and with good reason. His reign would be a non-stop chess match between the Pope, the German princes, the rebellious Sicilian nobility, and his own family members. Constance, for her part, kept her head low and her presence steady. She wasn't flashy, but she was undeniably central. Now here's the genetic side note. The Hohenstaufens, like the Aragonese, had already been marrying within the same handful of noble families for generations. That means Constance and Frederick, though from different countries, shared at least a few ancestors within 3 or 4 generations, making their children yet another link in the slow tightening of Europe's noble bloodline noose. Their son, Henry VII of Germany, would eventually rebel against his father, suffer from periods of depression and erratic behaviour, and die in prison, possibly by suicide. Is that nature or nurture? Well, the debate still rages. Some argue that Henry inherited his father's paranoia and his mother's melancholy, both of which may have been exacerbated by inherited traits passed through generations of intermarriage. But back to Constance. She wasn't just a bystander in all this. During Frederick's frequent absences, either fighting crusades, dodging papal excommunications, or playing philosopher king in his court at Palermo, Constance served as regent of Sicily. She issued decrees, collected taxes, and oversaw court disputes. In other words, she ruled, quietly, efficiently, and with a political savvy that suggests she knew exactly how thin the line was between queen and scapegoat. And to her credit, she managed to keep Sicily relatively stable in a time when stability was about as common as indoor plumbing. A quirky detail, Constance reportedly had a deep interest in astronomy, and was known to attend public celestial lectures in Palermo. This was during the court's brief intellectual renaissance. Frederick was into Greek philosophy, Islamic medicine, and astrology, and Constance seems to have soaked up the culture. One chronicler mentions her spending long evenings on palace terraces, studying the stars while court musicians played softly nearby. It paints a peaceful picture, though one suspects it was more escapism than leisure. But like most royal women of her era, Constance's health became an issue after multiple pregnancies and years of stress. There's little detailed medical record, because of course there isn't, but letters from the time suggest she suffered from a wasting of the body in her later years. Today we might call it chronic fatigue, or maybe a slow degenerative disease, or maybe it was just the natural result of carrying centuries of compounded cousin DNA through war, exile and court drama. She died in 1222, just 3 years after being crowned Empress of the Holy Roman Empire. Frederick would go on to remarry several times, in fact, and continue the family's long tradition of strategic inbreeding. But Constance, she faded into historical footnotes, remembered mostly as the quiet queen who kept Sicily on track while her husband played Emperor Savant across Europe. Scholars today argue about her significance. Was she merely a placeholder, another Habsburg-adjacent woman who did her job and died quietly? Or was she the steadying force behind one of the most chaotic reigns in medieval history? The evidence is thin, but what survives suggests she had more influence than she's usually credited with, especially in a world where royal women were expected to birth heirs, say prayers, and not much else. One thing's clear, the DNA she carried and passed on would continue to ripple through European history. Her descendants would include not just emperors, but eventually the very same Habsburgs who would marry themselves into facial collapse. So in a way, Constance of Aragon is less a character than a cornerstone. The beginning of the blueprint, proof that even in the early days, the ruling houses of Europe were already writing a love letter to genetic roulette. Next, we'll shift our gaze to England's side of the tapestry and meet Margaret of York, who didn't bring inbred blood to the table so much as she married into the eye of the Habsburg storm, and watched the family gene pool start to boil. Now we cross the Channel, slipping past white cliffs and the damp English air, to find ourselves in a world that feels oddly familiar. York roses, velvet cloaks, whispers in cathedral aisles. But instead of entering the fray of inbreeding from the birth side, we're stepping into it from the marital edge. Meet Margaret of York. She isn't inbred herself, not particularly, at least not by the dizzying standards we've been charting, but she married right into the core of the Habsburg machine, and what she witnessed from inside those glittering hereditary hallways tells us just as much about the dangers of royal bloodlines as any genealogical chart ever could. Born in 1446 to Richard Plantagenet, Duke of York and Cecily Neville, Margaret grew up amid the violent highs and lows of the Wars of the Roses. Her family was stacked with English royalty, but her childhood was far from peaceful. Her father was killed in battle. Her brothers Edward and Richard would become kings, one triumphantly, one briefly and tragically, and the Yorkist faction to which she belonged would see itself rise, fall and rise again. Margaret was the archetypal royal daughter, educated, poised, politically valuable. By her early teens, she was already being floated as a marriage prospect across Europe. A brief flirtation with a marriage to the future James III of Scotland didn't pan out. Then the offer came from Burgundy. Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, needed a wife, not for love, of course, this was never about love, but for strategy. Burgundy at that time was a kind of semi-independent power caught between France and the Holy Roman Empire. It needed allies. Margaret's brother Edward IV was now King of England, and an alliance between York and Burgundy would put pressure on France from two sides. So Margaret was chosen. In 1468, at age 22, she sailed to Bruges and married Charles. She never returned to England. Now Charles the Bold was a man with a temper like a lit cannon. He was fierce, stubborn, and obsessed with war, but he was also rich, richer than most kings, and his court was one of the most glamorous in Europe. Margaret stepped into a world of gleaming armour, grand processions, and more embroidery than the Vatican's laundry room. But beneath the surface, trouble. Burgundy, like many smaller states of the era, was always one bad marriage or one heirless death away from political collapse. And Charles had no surviving sons, so Margaret, without delay, was expected to provide one. Here's the rub: she didn't. Historians still debate whether she was infertile, whether Charles had his own issues, or whether sheer stress played a role. But no children came from the marriage, and in the absence of an heir, Burgundy's position became more precarious. Charles died in battle in 1477, leaving behind a single daughter, Marie of Burgundy, from his previous marriage. So Margaret, now a widow, didn't fade into history as a forgotten consort. She became a major player in the next dynastic shuffle. And this is where things get messy. Marie of Burgundy inherited a kingdom but had no husband. Every major power in Europe saw her as an opportunity. France, the Empire, even England made gestures. Margaret, now acting as Marie's de facto advisor, helped guide her toward a match that would forever change the fate of Europe, Maximilian of Habsburg. Yes, that Maximilian, the same one who married Marie, inherited Burgundy, and merged the Habsburg and Burgundian lines, creating the foundation for the eventual Holy Roman Spanish superpower combo that would rule half of Europe. That was Margaret's doing. She saw the political winds shifting and chose to throw her support behind a match that prioritised dynasty over emotion. Marie and Maximilian married, and with that the Habsburgs acquired some of the richest and most strategically important lands in Europe. And Margaret? She stayed in the Netherlands, took a vow of celibacy, and became known as the Great Lady of Mechelen. She advised her step-grandchildren, Philip the Handsome among them, and managed court affairs with quiet precision. She lived for decades after her husband's death, becoming a kind of dowager queen without a crown, surrounded by the very bloodline she helped secure, and watching year by year as it began to fold in on itself. You have to wonder what she thought as the first signs of Habsburg inbreeding started to appear. She would have seen Philip the Handsome, who inherited her Burgundian refinement but also a certain manic restlessness. She would have heard whispers about his marriage to Joanna of Castile, about the instability, the death, the heavy silence. She watched as marriages were arranged between cousins and uncles and nieces. She, who came from a court that had fought tooth and nail for legitimacy through war and rebellion, must have wondered what kind of future was being forged now with ink, blood, and holy dispensation. A quirky fact. Margaret had a personal devotion to the cult of Saint Colette, a reformer saint known for her austere habits and refusal to compromise. Margaret once had a room in her palace where she held regular prayer sessions beneath a ceiling painted with the genealogical tree of Christ. Talk about foreshadowing, lineage was literally the ceiling above her head. Her legacy, while often overshadowed by flashier figures, is immense. Without Margaret, the Burgundian lands might have fallen into French hands. Without her, Mary might have married a French prince, and the Habsburg-Burgundy fusion may never have happened. It was her political intuition, not her womb, that secured her place in history. So no, Margaret of York wasn't inbred, but she married into a dynasty that would define itself by it. She watched the first threads twist together, heard the early echoes of an inherited madness, and saw what happens when dynastic ambition trumps common sense. She died in 1503, aged 57, having outlived her husband, her stepdaughter, and many of the children she helped raise. Her bones were laid to rest in Mechelen, where a statue still stands, solemn, watching, silent. Next, we return to the root of it all, not just the individuals, but the system itself. It's time to talk about the grandmothers of Marie Antoinette, and the multi-generational tangle that made the French Revolution less of a surprise and more of a slow-motion train wreck waiting to happen. Now the candle flickers low, and you can almost hear the distant rustle of silk skirts and powdered wigs being adjusted in ornate mirrors. The century has changed again. We're in the 18th now, and the spotlight shifts to a group of women whose faces you probably wouldn't recognise, but whose blood ran straight into the storm of the French Revolution. These are the grandmothers of Marie Antoinette, a tangle of Habsburgs and Bourbons, of Holy Roman Empresses and Spanish Infantas, whose pedigrees looked like antique jigsaw puzzles and whose marriages were less about love than about strategic genetic recycling. Together, they helped produce one of history's most famous royal scapegoats, Marie herself, that doomed teen queen with the sky-high hair. And none of them, not a single one, escaped the web of dynastic inbreeding. Let's start with one of the most pivotal pieces, Elizabeth Farnese. Born in 1692 to the Duke of Parma and his cousin Dorothea Sophia of Neuburg, Elizabeth was already a product of the cousin marriage by the time she took her first steps. She grew up with impeccable breeding and big ambitions. In 1714 she married King Philip V of Spain, who, plot twist, was also her cousin, albeit once or twice removed depending on how generously you draw the tree. This wasn't just a personal union, it was the reinforcement of Bourbon-Habsburg cooperation through mutual DNA. And let's just say Elizabeth made herself known. She became the de facto ruler of Spain within months of arriving, wielding more influence than any courtier had predicted. She produced a brood of children who would scatter across Europe and bring that distinctive Habsburg-Bourbon blend to every palace from Naples to Parma. One of those children was Maria Theresa Raffaello of Spain. Now, she doesn't get a lot of screen time in most history books, but here's where the branches start to loop dangerously close together. Maria Theresa was married off to Louis, Dauphin of France, the son of Louis XV. Again, Bourbon meets Bourbon. Their daughter would have been a future Queen of France, but Maria Theresa died young, because of course she did, from complications in childbirth at the age of 20. Her death was considered tragic, yet completely expected. Another royal woman, another body sacrificed to the endless machine of heir production. But she wasn't the only grandmother in this lineage. Meanwhile, over in Vienna, we find another titan of dynastic strategy, Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. Now you might be thinking, wait, isn't that Marie Antoinette's mother? Yes, but stick with me, the story begins earlier. Maria Theresa was the daughter of Emperor Charles VI and Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, a mouthful of a name for someone who, by the time of her marriage, was considered a reasonable genetic bet despite already having Habsburg ties. Her daughter, Maria Theresa, would go on to rule as empress in her own right, a rare, formidable woman in a sea of powdered men, and she did what every Habsburg ruler was supposed to do, marry strategically and marry repeatedly. Maria Theresa had 16 children. 16! And almost every one of them was used as a diplomatic tool. She married her daughters into every eligible royal house in Europe like a living game of Risk, each union carefully calculated to reinforce Habsburg influence. One daughter went to Parma, another to Naples, another to Modena. And one, our star, Marie Antoinette, was sent to France. Now here's the genetic kicker. These children weren't marrying strangers. They were marrying pisons, second cousins, occasionally nephews. Some of the Bourbon matches included bloodlines that had already tangled with Habsburg stock 3 or 4 times in the past century. Marie Antoinette, for example, married Louis Auguste, later Louis XVI, who was her cousin through multiple shared ancestors, including Louis XIV and Philip IV of Spain. Their family trees weren't just entwined, they were practically hugging. And it showed. Marie Antoinette's facial structure, the long nose, the slight chin, had echoes of her great-grandmother's portraits. She had difficulty conceiving for the first several years of her marriage, which created scandalous rumours and deep court anxiety. And while she eventually had children, her son Louis Charles, who would become Louis XVII in title only, died in prison during the Revolution, likely from tuberculosis and neglect, but possibly also from a compromised immune system that couldn't fight off even the smallest infection. A quirky fact buried in all this: Marie Antoinette's maternal grandmother, Elizabeth Christine, was known for keeping peacocks as pets, like actual peacocks. She claimed their mournful cries reminded her of the Virgin Mary's sorrow, which tells you everything you need to know about the general psychological atmosphere of the Habsburg court. Grand symbolism, religious guilt, and a sprinkling of melodrama served fresh daily. The scholarly debate surrounding these women, these grandmothers of decline, is layered. Some historians argue that the Habsburgs and Bourbons were simply doing what they had to do in an age where alliances mattered more than health. Others, with the benefit of genetic hindsight, claim that this relentless cousin matching created a fragile elite, intelligent, yes, but emotionally erratic, reproductively challenged, and prone to premature death. One modern genealogist referred to the line that led to Marie Antoinette as a downward spiral in silk gloves, which is both haunting and frankly accurate. And what's tragic is that these women had no choice. Maria Theresa Raffaella didn't pick her husband. Empress Maria Theresa loved her children fiercely but used them like bargaining chips. Elizabeth Farnese controlled policy but not biology. They were all trapped in the same gilded cage, expected to breed for the glory of the state, even if it meant watching their daughters die in childbirth or their sons grow sickly and suspicious. Their descendants would sit on thrones, yes, but also in wheelchairs and sickbeds, and eventually in prison cells. And while we remember Marie Antoinette for her hair, her diamonds, and her guillotine, it's worth remembering the women who came before her, who built the staircase she would one day be pushed down. Next, we'll leave the throne rooms and slip into the quieter chambers, where miscarriages, mysterious illnesses, and hushed funerals show us the true cost of dynastic obsession, hidden behind veils, whispered down corridors, and recorded only in the margins. Now the echoes of royal proclamations fade, and we pass through a smaller, quieter door, the one behind the throne, the one where royal women lived when they weren't being paraded in ceremony or posed for portraits. Here is the world of miscarriages, mystery ailments, locked bedchambers, and the silences that followed. For all the crowns and titles we've wandered through, this is where the real cost of inbreeding, and its relentless demands, was often paid, not in courtrooms, but in the shadowy space between cradle and coffin. Tonight, we descend into the personal tragedies of medieval and early modern queens, the ones no historian ever bothered to paint, and the ones whose stories were often smothered under layers of euphemism and incense. Let's start with a grim but consistent reality. Childbearing among royals was a full-time occupation, and failure was not an option. But failure came anyway, again and again. Miscarriages, stillbirths, infants who lived only long enough to be baptised and wrapped in white silk. Royal records rarely list these events clearly. Instead, you get vague phrases like, "the Queen was unwell," "a sorrowful occurrence," or, in truly understated moments, "an heir was expected, but none came." In between those phrases are lifetimes of heartbreak, blood loss, and buried children whose names were never even recorded. One of the most well-documented cases is Catherine of Aragon. As we explored earlier, she had at least 6 pregnancies during her marriage to Henry VIII, and only one child survived, Mary Tudor. Her other pregnancies ended in miscarriage or early infant death, including a boy who lived for just a few weeks. The pressure on her was astronomical. The emotional toll was invisible. What we rarely talk about is that Catherine believed God was punishing her, and that belief was reinforced by everyone around her. There were no conversations about recessive genes or Rh incompatibility. There was only guilt, penance, and prayer. But Catherine was far from alone. Joanna of Castile, her sister, also suffered miscarriages. So did Isabella of Portugal, who had 3 children that didn't survive beyond infancy. So did Barbara of Austria. So did countless others. It became a pattern so frequent that royal courts built entire protocols around the expectation of death. Cribs were ordered and placed in rooms that were already being measured for tiny coffins. Midwives doubled as morticians. Mourning veils were stored in the same drawers as baptismal gowns. The medical understanding of these losses was, of course, painfully limited. Queens were bled, fed herbal mixtures, subjected to prayers and rituals designed to balance the humours. In some courts, like Spain and Austria, it was believed that excessive devotion could cause uterine melancholy, a made-up illness that basically blamed religious piety for infertility. The irony is almost cruel. These women were expected to be saints and broodmares at the same time. Now enter the real horror show, the mystery ailments, chronic headaches, muscle wasting, sudden fevers, swellings, hysteria. Hallucinations. Many royal women began experiencing symptoms in their late teens or early 20s, especially after their first pregnancies. Some of this could be chalked up to poor nutrition, infections, or the general stress of being locked in a velvet cage for life. But increasingly modern scholars point to inbreeding as a contributing factor, specifically the accumulation of recessive genetic conditions like haemophilia, epilepsy, or certain forms of autoimmune disease. Take Anna of Austria, Philip II's niece wife. She bore several children, including the future Philip III, but her letters suggest chronic exhaustion, anxiety, and what we'd now call postpartum depression. She died at 30 after yet another pregnancy. Nothing dramatic, nothing scandalous, just one more royal body that quietly collapsed under the weight of doing what was expected. Or look at Isabella of Bourbon, mother of Marie of Burgundy. She had recurring fevers that never fully went away after childbirth. Historians believe she may have had lupus or another autoimmune disease, conditions that we now know can have genetic origins and flare dramatically after pregnancy. She died young, like so many others, and was remembered mostly for being obedient and modest. And then there are the cases that defy even modern classification. Women who suddenly became mad, screaming at nothing, talking to ghosts, refusing to eat. Sometimes they were locked away, other times simply declared unfit and replaced. Juana of Castile's mental health struggles have been endlessly debated, but she's just the most famous example of a much larger pattern. Were these psychological collapses, brain tumours, genetic neurological disorders? We may never know. What we do know is that they almost always occurred in women from families that had been marrying cousins for generations. One particularly chilling example, Eleanor of Austria, sister to Charles V. She suffered severe insomnia, hallucinations, and what her doctors called womb-driven confusion. Her treatment? Bleeding, isolation, and enforced silence. She recovered, sort of, a royal, and went on to marry the King of France. But court records show she never bore a healthy child, and she died early, remembered only for her looks and her good behaviour. And the children? Oh, the children. So many royal infants were born sickly, with what were politely termed delicate constitutions. There are accounts of princes with seizures, babies who bled excessively from small wounds, or toddlers who failed to develop language or coordination. The word rickets appears frequently. So does wasting. In many cases, these children were hidden away, raised in private until they either miraculously thrived or quietly disappeared from the record. A quirky and tragic footnote. In the Austrian court, it became customary in the 17th century to commission miniature coffins for children in advance, just in case. These were painted with scenes of heaven, angels, and family crests. Some even included tiny gowns and lace pillows tucked away in drawers near the nursery. That's how common infant death had become. That's how normal the abnormal had turned. Modern historians continue to debate the role of inbreeding in all this. Some say it's overstated, that poor sanitation and lack of antibiotics played bigger roles. Others argue that once you stack enough cousin marriages, the odds of recessive conditions showing up multiply, and in the royal houses of Spain, Austria and France, those odds were exploited past the breaking point. What's undeniable is the emotional toll. Royal women were expected to perform miracle after miracle, get pregnant, deliver a living child, and return to court within days looking radiant. When they failed, when their bodies betrayed them, the blame was swift and brutal. Their husbands took mistresses, their advisors whispered, the people judged, and the women themselves? They rarely left behind letters that expressed the full weight of what they felt. Only scraps, a sentence here, a note scrawled in a prayer book, a single line from a midwife. The Queen weeps alone. Next we'll explore what may be the most visible symptom of this entire dynasty's collapse. The infamous Habsburg jaw, its physical manifestations, its roots, and the women who bore it forward across generations like a badge and a burden. Now we arrive at the most infamous facial feature in European history, the protruding, squared-off, cartoonishly memorable Habsburg jaw. You've seen it in portraits, perhaps without even realising. That elongated lower face, the thick jawbone jutting proudly from beneath tightly pursed lips, a chin that looks like it could deflect cannon fire. It appears generation after generation, passed down like a royal sceptre, and it became more than just a physical trait. It became a symbol of power, of stubborn bloodlines, and of what happens when you marry your cousin, and then keep doing it, over and over, for centuries. Let's break it down. The Habsburg jaw, technically called mandibular prognathism, is a condition where the lower jaw extends beyond the upper jaw, creating an underbite. In mild cases, it just looks like a strong chin. In severe cases, which the Habsburgs eventually achieved with terrifying efficiency, it caused difficulties with speech, chewing, and even breathing. Modern medical researchers have studied portraits, exhumed skulls, and even compared royal death masks to reconstruct the history of this trait. And what they found? It got worse with time, much worse. While both men and women in the Habsburg line showed signs of the jaw, it's the women who had to wear it differently. A man could parade his prominent chin as a badge of authority, a symbol of dynasty. But for women, it was a different story. Beauty mattered, elegance mattered, and the Habsburg jaw was about as subtle as a battering ram. In portraits, you can see how artists tried to soften or hide it. Lips are blurred, shadows painted just so, angles manipulated to de-emphasize the jut. But the bone doesn't lie, and neither does the history. Take Isabella Clara Eugenia, for example. In her early portraits, her chin is only slightly pronounced. The paintings depict her with the dignity, composure, and what you might call a mild prognosis. But by the time we get to Maria Anna of Spain, granddaughter of Philip III, the jaw is undeniable, stark, angular, nearly anatomical. Her portraits look stiff not because of her posture, but because the painter is struggling to present her in a flattering light without painting what was essentially a built-in anatomical protest against beauty standards. And then there's Mariana of Austria, both niece and wife to Philip IV. Yes, niece and wife. Her jawline was so famously exaggerated that contemporary observers commented on it, even in a time when royal flaws were supposed to be politely ignored. Her face is noble, wrote one ambassador, but curiously extended at the chin, which is court speak for she looks like she's chewing on something invisible. Mariana had trouble closing her mouth fully. She suffered frequent jaw pain, and yet she gave birth to the last and most tragic bearer of the Habsburg jaw, Charles II of Spain. We'll get to Charles in more detail soon, but just know for now, the jaw reached its final form in him. His mandibular prognathism was so severe that he couldn't chew properly. He drooled, slurred his speech, and needed to be spoon-fed soft foods well into adulthood. His jawbone wasn't just cosmetic, it was disabling, and it was inherited, specifically from a line of women who had passed it along, generation by generation, often without even understanding the damage they were carrying. Now here's the wild thing. Modern geneticists have studied the degree of inbreeding in this dynasty and found something jaw-droppingly, pun intended, fascinating. A study from 2009 used facial analysis and genealogical data to track the correlation between the jaw and the level of inbreeding. They discovered that the severity of the Habsburg jaw directly matched the coefficient of inbreeding. In simpler terms, the more cousin marriages in a person's ancestry, the bigger the jaw. And it wasn't just the jaw. Alongside it came other facial traits now understood to be linked to inbreeding. Wide-set eyes, long noses, narrow palates, drooping eyelids. In some cases, women were reported to have difficulty with speech development as children, or struggled with dental alignment severe enough to cause chronic pain. So why did no one stop it? Why did these families, staring at children who could barely speak or chew, keep marching forward with cousin marriages? The answer is both simple and horrifying: power. These marriages weren't about love or health, they were about sealing borders, preserving wealth, and avoiding the chaos of foreign claims to the throne. A cousin was safer than a stranger, a niece was even better, and if the result was a jaw that looked like it could store walnuts, well, that was a small price to pay for empire. A quirky fact: the Habsburg jaw made it into satire. In 18th century plays and pamphlets, especially in France and the Netherlands, the trait was exaggerated in political cartoons to mock Spanish royalty. One popular image showed a noblewoman with a chin so long it had its own crown. In these depictions, the jaw became shorthand for everything wrong with dynastic inbreeding: arrogance, dysfunction, and self-destruction wrapped up in court brocade. And yet, there were women who wore it with dignity. Maria Theresa of Austria, Marie Antoinette's mother, had a strong jawline, and while not as severe as later generations, it was noticeable. Still, she ruled with authority, had 16 children, and manoeuvred through the political maze of Enlightenment Europe without letting her facial structure slow her down. Her portraits don't try to hide her chin, they own it. It's almost a flex. Yes, I have the jaw and I still run this empire. Historians still argue about whether the jaw itself caused suffering, or was just a visible marker of a deeper problem. Some say it was symbolic, proof of inbreeding, yes, but not itself a cause of collapse. Others point out that the jaw wasn't just an unfortunate trait, it was the tip of the genetic iceberg. Behind it were immune disorders, fertility issues, and neurological problems that couldn't be painted over. The women who carried the jaw weren't villains, they were trapped. Trained from birth to understand that their greatest value lay in continuing the dynasty, they married as instructed, bore children as demanded, and passed on not just titles, but traits that haunted their descendants. When they looked in the mirror, did they recognise it? Did they see the chin as a sign of duty or a curse? Next, we'll step into the heart of this debate, where scholars and scientists clash over what really brought down these dynasties. Was it the jaw, the madness, or something more subtle? Let's pull apart the myths and see what's left when the velvet curtain drops. Now we draw closer to the edge of understanding, past the portraits and court rituals, past the bloodlines and gilded ledgers, and into the minds of scholars who've spent centuries arguing over one thing: what really brought down the great dynasties of Europe? Was it truly inbreeding that cracked the thrones of Habsburg Spain and Bourbon France? Or have generations of storytellers simply turned genetic quirks into myths because the truth is harder to pin down? In this section, we slip behind the textbooks and step into the quiet, obsessive corners of academia, where historians, doctors and data nerds battle over whether madness, infertility and physical deformity were a product of royal policies or exaggerated symptoms of dynasties already teetering for entirely different reasons. Let's start with one of the biggest ongoing debates. Was inbreeding the cause of royal mental instability, or just a convenient excuse? The most frequently cited example, of course, is Joanna of Castile. She's remembered as Joanna the Mad, a nickname handed to her by men who needed her out of the way. She talked to the dead. She screamed during storms. She was locked in a convent for most of her adult life. But historians today can't agree on whether her breakdown was genetic or situational. Yes, she was the product of cousin marriage. Yes, mental illness ran through her family. But she also endured forced separation from her children, intense political pressure, and a court that weaponized her grief to discredit her. One camp of scholars believes Joanna may have had bipolar disorder exacerbated by trauma. Others say paranoid schizophrenia. Still others argue she was simply a woman reacting very normally to being surrounded by powerful men trying to institutionalize her. It's not a small question, because if Joanna was genuinely ill, she may represent one of the earliest documented cases of inherited mental instability in royal lines. If she wasn't, she's proof that the Mad Queen narrative was often used to cover political coups with a layer of faux medical legitimacy. The same arguments swirl around others. Charles VI of France, for example, famously thought he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. Sounds like madness, but was it the result of generations of close blood marriages in the Valois line? Or was it the crushing pressure of kingship in a collapsing feudal state? Charles II of Spain, who we'll get to soon, is often described as mentally challenged, physically debilitated, and emotionally immature. But again, we're relying on letters written by courtiers with motives, physicians with 17th century knowledge, and portraitists who painted what they were told to. Another major debate lies in the realm of infertility and stillbirths. Was it the result of genetic disorders, or was it just the tragic norm of pre-modern childbirth? It's true that royal women often miscarried or had children who died young. Catherine of Aragon, Barbara of Austria, Isabella of Bourbon. The list is long. But so is the list of commoner women who faced the same tragedies. The difference? Royals were expected to produce healthy heirs like clockwork. When they didn't, people started looking for patterns, and they often found them in the family tree. Recent studies have tried to measure this. Geneticists working with historical data have looked at the inbreeding coefficient, a number that represents how likely someone is to inherit 2 copies of the same gene from a common ancestor. The average person's number is around 0. The higher the number, the more likely genetic disorders are to show up. Charles II of Spain, his inbreeding coefficient was calculated at 0.25, the equivalent of a child born to siblings. That's not rumour, that's math. But most queens didn't reach that number. Their coefficients hovered around 0.06 to 0.125, comparable to first cousin marriages. Dangerous, yes, but not an automatic death sentence. Here's where things get blurry. Critics argue that modern science loves a clean narrative, and inbreeding is a tempting villain. It's easier to blame a jaw or a mental breakdown on DNA than on politics, warfare or misogyny. For every scholar who claims the Habsburgs were undone by their own chromosomes, there's another who says, hold on, maybe it was economic mismanagement, climate change, religious fragmentation, or 100 other factors. After all, France didn't fall because of Marie Antoinette's lineage. It fell because the people were starving, and the crown kept pretending everything was fine. Then there's the issue of propaganda. Royal women were often deliberately discredited by rival factions who needed a reason to remove or sideline them. Calling a queen barren, mad or deformed was an easy way to shake public confidence in the regime. And once the rumour started, it stuck. Maria Theresa of Spain was painted as slow and clumsy by French courtiers who didn't want her at Versailles. Elizabeth of Valois was said to be emotionally unstable, mostly because she didn't enjoy being ignored by her much older husband. Were these real conditions, or just slander in satin? Even the Habsburg jaw itself might be more myth than malady in some cases. Modern facial analysis of painted portraits is, let's be honest, a little subjective. Artists flattered their subjects, exaggerated features to emphasise nobility, and operated under stylistic conventions that might have made a normal chin look dramatic. Some scholars believe the jaw became a symbolic shorthand for degeneracy, rather than an actual physical marker in every case. Once people started seeing it, they saw it everywhere. A quirky but telling example: in the 19th century, long after the Spanish Habsburg line had ended, European race theorists started using the Habsburg jaw as evidence of racial purity gone wrong, a twisted kind of reverse eugenics. They claimed it was what happened when you tried to keep a bloodline too pure. This idea filtered into medical textbooks, cartoons, and even early film. By the 20th century, the Habsburg jaw wasn't just a medical condition, it was a cultural punchline. So where does that leave us? Probably somewhere between truth and theatre. Yes, inbreeding led to real measurable problems. Yes, the dynasties that embraced cousin marriage suffered more from mental and physical issues over time. But no, not every royal woman who miscarried was cursed, not every queen with a long face was deformed, and not every dynasty collapsed because of bad DNA. Sometimes they were just bad at ruling, but the myth persists, because it's tidy, because it gives us a way to look at power and say, well, that's what they get. It's poetic justice carved into bone. Next, we head into the final loop of this twisted tale, to the women behind the fall of the Habsburg line. Not just victims of biology, but key players in the dynasty's implosion. We'll meet the ones who gave birth to the end, one chromosome at a time. Now the spiral begins to tighten. We've danced through portraits and letters, medical oddities and court intrigues, but this next part, this is the slow-motion collapse, the genetic endgame of royal Europe playing out in the marble halls of palaces and the whispered prayers of midwives. Tonight, we focus on the women who are more than just carriers of crowns and dynasties. These women were the genetic glue, the final binding agents in centuries of strategic intermarriage meant to keep power consolidated. Except, of course, that glue had been thinned by time and stress and too many shared ancestors. These queens didn't just pass on kingdoms, they passed on the quiet ticking of dynastic collapse. Let's begin with Mariana of Austria. A name you've heard already, or will we? She married her uncle, Philip IV of Spain, in a move so genetically reckless it might as well have been shouted across Europe. Mariana was the daughter of Maria Anna of Spain, who herself was the sister of Philip IV. So when Philip married Mariana, he married his sister's daughter. If your brain is buzzing, that's the sound of your family tree folding in on itself like origami in a wind tunnel. Their marriage was meant to keep the Spanish and Austrian branches of the Habsburgs locked together, but the result was Charles II, the final Habsburg ruler of Spain, who was a medical disaster in royal drag. Mariana had a brutal role. She was expected to produce heirs from a gene pool that had long since stopped offering options. She had 5 children with Philip IV. Only one, Charles, survived. And what a survival it was. From birth, Charles had difficulty feeding, delayed development, and physical abnormalities so pronounced that court physicians started suggesting he might be unfit to rule before he could even walk. Mariana loved him fiercely. She became his regent after Philip's death and ruled Spain in his name for years, trying to hold together a kingdom that was falling apart in more ways than one. But Mariana wasn't alone in this final wave of fragile royalty. Across Europe in the Austrian court, Maria Anna of Austria, another cousin, was marrying Maximilian II, Emmanuel of Bavaria. Their son, Charles Albert, would go on to become Holy Roman Emperor, but he too bore signs of the dynasty's increasingly precarious bloodline. He suffered from chronic migraines, extreme mood swings, and what one courtier described as episodes of great confusion. He was brilliant, yes, but also volatile, emotionally distant and physically weak. His marriage to Maria Amalia of Austria didn't help much, since she was his cousin and also a Habsburg. Meanwhile, in the southern stretch of the Habsburg Empire, the Kingdom of Naples was seeing similar echoes. Maria Amalia of Saxony, married to Charles III of Spain, was another cog in the familial recycling system. Though not a Habsburg by name, she was the result of similar intermarriages among German and Italian nobility. Her children included Ferdinand I of the Two Sicilies, whose descendants would keep showing up in various royal bloodlines with alarming health issues: low fertility, club feet, epilepsy. A court physician once observed that the blood is noble but exhausted. That's about as poetic as a diagnosis gets. A quieter, often overlooked figure in this genetic domino effect is Margaret Theresa of Spain, the daughter of Mariana and Philip IV, and technically Charles II's older sister. She was married off to Leopold I, her maternal uncle. Yes, again a brother marrying his niece. Margaret was only 15 at the time. Her marriage was celebrated with fanfare and art. She's the girl in the centre of Velázquez's Las Meninas, that eerie portrait where even the dog looks uncomfortable. But Margaret's life was short. She gave birth to 4 children, only one of whom survived infancy. She died at 21, likely from complications of pregnancy, a condition that kept reoccurring in women who were increasingly expected to bear children from men who shared large chunks of their DNA. Let's pause for a curious twist. Throughout all of this, many of these women were renowned for their piety. Marianne of Austria practically lived in black, attending Mass constantly, and surrounding herself with confessors. Margaret Theresa was praised for her obedient virtue. Maria Amalia was known for fasting during Lent, to the point of fainting, and yet these women, devout, obedient and royal to their bones, were caught in a system that rewarded their faith with declining bodies and broken lineages. There's also a strange shift happening here. The royal women of earlier centuries were mostly passive figures in their dynastic stories, shipped from one court to another, bred like prized mares. But these late Habsburg queens, they had agency, and that made the tragedy feel sharper. Mariana wielded political power, oversaw military decisions, and held her ground in the face of papal meddling. Margaret Theresa corresponded with philosophers. Maria Anna of Austria funded libraries. These were not shrinking violets. They were smart, engaged women who were just boxed in by the genetics of ambition. And the debates rage on. Some historians insist that the collapse of the Spanish Habsburgs was purely political, wars, debt, empire overstretch. Others point to the raw biological data, the sky-high inbreeding coefficients, the accumulation of physical and mental defects, the early deaths and childless marriages. Still others argue it was both, that the genetic frailty was a metaphor made literal, that a system so obsessed with preserving itself eventually built a throne no one healthy enough could sit on. Quirky historical side note? One physician during Charles II's time insisted that the only cure for the royal family's decline was to introduce fresh blood through the modest veins of a common-born maiden. He was promptly dismissed, but he may have been the only one in the room with the right idea. By the time the 18th century dawned, it was clear something had gone deeply wrong. Heirs were harder to come by. Queens were dying younger. Royal families were importing brides from increasingly distant houses just to keep the recessive traits at bay. But for Spain and Austria it was already too late. The women who had been tasked with holding it together, Mariana, Margaret, Maria Anna, had done everything expected of them. They had prayed, they had married, they had given birth, but in the end they were the last glue sticks in a collapsing sculpture, beautiful, brittle, and doomed from the start. Next, we'll peer into the weirdest corridors of these royal family trees, those fringe cases where a woman was her own aunt, where brothers married sisters-in-law twice removed, and where political desperation created marriages so tangled even the Vatican raised its eyebrows. Now we plunge into the strangest corners of the medieval and early modern royal gene pool. The kind of branches on the family tree where you're no longer sure which direction is up, and where a woman might be her own aunt, her cousin's stepmother, and possibly her future daughter-in-law if things go just slightly more sideways. These are the fringe cases, the genealogical accidents born not just of inbreeding, but of pure dynastic desperation. Because when power is the only real inheritance, and everyone else is considered too politically risky to marry, the nobility starts to get creative, and occasionally absurd. Let's start with one of the most bewildering of examples. Anna of Austria, here, yes, another Anna. Don't worry, this one comes with extra footnotes. She was both the niece and the fourth wife of King Philip II of Spain. That's right. Philip had already been married 3 times, once to Mary Tudor of England, then to Elizabeth of Valois, and then briefly widowed, when he decided to marry Anna, the daughter of his sister Maria and Emperor Maximilian II. So to break that down, he married his sister's daughter, which made his new wife also his niece. And when they had children, they were also Philip's grandnephews by blood. One of those children would grow up to be Philip III, perpetuating the Habsburg legacy of jawlines and crossed chromosomes. Anna's case is infamous, but not unique. In fact, the Habsburgs in particular began specialising in marriages where multiple family roles could be filled by one person. The logic went something like this. If your cousin is already Catholic, already wealthy and already on your Christmas card list, why waste time importing someone new? It's the 16th century version of online dating with one filter. Must be related to me in at least two ways. Another bizarre case, Maria Antonia of Austria, daughter of Emperor Leopold III and Margaret Theresa of Spain. Remember her, the girl from Las Meninas? Well, she was married off to her cousin, Maximilian II Emmanuel of Bavaria, which made her both duchess and eventually step-grandmother to her own great-niece through a later union. If you're squinting at that sentence trying to find the logic, don't worry. The royal genealogists of the time often needed charts the size of carpets to keep it all straight. It got so convoluted that at least one court historian, attempting to describe the lineage of Maria Antonia's descendants, wrote, "Let the blood be noble even if the map is incomprehensible." Then there's Maria Anna of Bavaria, who married her maternal uncle, Ferdinand II, Holy Roman Emperor. She was his niece, and again no one at the time thought this was especially odd. The Vatican had to sign off on a dispensation for nearly every royal wedding at this point, because canon law technically prohibited such close unions, but it had become almost a formality. These weren't marriages made for morality, they were treaties in brocade. What's even stranger is how these tangled lines were treated at court. People didn't flinch when someone married their aunt's widower, or their half-brother's son. Instead, they applauded it as a show of dynastic loyalty. You weren't just preserving the family legacy, you were wrapping yourself in it like a velvet cloak lined with second cousins. And if you squint hard enough, you'll find cases where two sisters married the same man, one after the other, so the kingdom wouldn't lose a dowry. Sometimes that man was also their cousin, or uncle, or both. A particularly murky case involves Blanche of Bourbon, who was married off to Peter of Castile and then abandoned within days. Peter married again, bigamously, to Maria de Padilla, who was actually related to Blanche through two different lines. Some sources say Peter's entire reason for discarding Blanche was that she didn't produce a child immediately. Others say he just preferred Maria, but the court didn't protest, because even his second choice was close enough in blood to pass muster. One of the more uncomfortable examples comes from Joanna of Austria, who was asked to consider marrying her own nephew at one point to maintain unity between Spain and Portugal. The plan fell through, not for genetic reasons, but because political tides shifted. Had it happened, she would have been both aunt and wife to the same man, and history wouldn't have blinked. Just another loop in a tapestry woven entirely out of cousin knots. A quirky eyebrow-raising trend that emerged from these inter-family marriages. The use of dynastic baby-naming loops. In many of these tangled families, the same names were recycled every generation. Maria, Anna, Isabella, Philip, Charles, until entire branches of the tree had identical names and birth years. In court documents, you had to specify which Maria Anna you were talking about by including her father's name and often her birth order. Imagine an entire palace where three women named Maria Anna lived within shouting distance of each other, each married to a different cousin. And yes, that really happened. Historians still puzzle over how these bizarre marriages were sustained. The working theory, dynastic paranoia, the fear of dilution. These families believed that only they were noble enough, Catholic enough, and rich enough to marry themselves. The concept of marrying down was worse than disease. So they kept it in the family, literally. The resulting relationships were less about affection and more about strategic entrapment. You didn't marry for love. You married so that no one else could claim your throne through a different womb. And here's the wildest twist. This pattern wasn't confined to monarchs. Even minor nobility, trying to emulate royal behaviour, began marrying their cousins and nieces, so the inbreeding pyramid widened at the base. What started with kings and queens spread into the ducal and baronial classes, until Europe was essentially one large interrelated brunch party with way too much velvet and way too little gene flow. But eventually the structure began to wobble. As more children were born sick, as more marriages ended in childlessness or deformity, even the most die-hard dynasties began to falter. Genetic counsellors didn't exist, but reality did. Monarchs started looking farther afield. German princesses were imported to Britain. French dukes married Danish brides. The intermarriage continued, but the loops began to uncoil, slowly, painfully, and far too late for many. Still, these fringe marriages leave behind a strange legacy. A paper trail of alliances so convoluted they almost feel fictional, but they weren't. These women, brides, nieces, sisters, second wives of second cousins, were real. They lived within the tightest constraints ever stitched into brocade. They were told, over and over, that love doesn't matter, but lineage does, and they obeyed, even when it meant becoming their own aunt by marriage or their cousin's second wife after their sister died. Next, we walk into the final echo chamber of this bloodline, the collapse that everyone saw coming but no one stopped. It's time for Charles II of Spain, the ultimate product of inbreeding and the final breath of the once great Habsburg line. Now the lights dim, the tapestries sag, and the echo of palace doors closing reverberates through a hollowed-out empire. All threads converge here, in the fragile, faltering figure of Charles II of Spain, a monarch so famously inbred that he's become the poster child for the consequences of royal genetic entrapment. Every story we've told, every woman who married her cousin, or bore a child to her uncle, all of it leads to this one final human blueprint. Charles wasn't just a king, he was a culmination. The Habsburg dynasty had spent centuries folding itself inward, and in Charles the folds began to tear. He was born in 1661 to Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, who, as you'll remember, was Philip's own niece. That alone gave Charles a mind-melting inbreeding coefficient of 0.254, equivalent to the genetic relationship of a child born to siblings. His family tree doesn't branch, it loops like a Mobius strip with ruffles. And when Charles arrived, it showed. Right from the beginning, everything about him was wrong. He couldn't talk until age 4, couldn't walk properly until past age 8. He drooled constantly. He suffered frequent seizures. And yet he was made king at age 4 because, well, that's how monarchies work. His court physicians were at a loss. Desperate to explain his condition without admitting the obvious, they blamed everything from demonic interference to the corruption of the humours. He was subjected to exorcisms, multiple. The clergy anointed his bed with holy oils. Priests chanted over his food. The superstitions swirled because no one wanted to say it plainly. The boy's body was crumbling under the pressure of inherited genetic collapse. Even his immune system seemed broken. He caught every illness that came within a mile of Madrid and survived most of them only because he was smothered in attention and probably herbal wine. Charles's face was unmistakably Habsburg. His mandibular prognathism, or Habsburg jaw, was so severe he couldn't properly chew solid food. His upper teeth didn't meet his lower ones, and his tongue was too large for his mouth. He spoke with difficulty, slurring and mumbling, often repeating himself in long loops. His court translators, yes, translators for his native language, learned to decode his speech the way one might learn to understand the rhythm of a broken bell. And yet, despite everything, they married him off. Twice. Because hope, or maybe denial, rings eternal in royal courts. His first wife was Marie-Louise of Orléans, a French princess. She was 15, vibrant, and by all accounts quite sweet. She was also reportedly terrified of Charles. He was sickly, awkward, and utterly dominated by his mother Mariana, who still ruled behind the scenes. Their marriage lasted 10 years. Marie-Louise never became pregnant. Not once. Whether that was because of her or Charles is still debated, but Charles's inability to consummate the marriage was an open secret. One contemporary wrote, "The king retires each night as if to a prayer cell, and the queen emerges each morning as unsatisfied as she entered." Marie-Louise died suddenly in 1689 at just 26. Poison was rumoured, because of course it was, but modern scholars suspect she simply collapsed from stress and illness. Charles was devastated. And the Habsburgs? They lined up the next wife. Enter Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess with 23 siblings. Yes, 23, chosen because her family was famously fertile. The thinking was, if anyone could get pregnant with a child of Charles, it would be her. Spoiler alert, she didn't. Their marriage was colder than the stone halls of the Escorial Palace. Maria Anna spent much of her time praying, writing letters home, and dodging the enormous pressure of producing a miracle heir from a man who could barely stand unassisted. Charles's decline was slow but relentless. His body twisted under its own weight, his hair fell out, his eyesight dimmed, his hearing grew worse. By the time he was 30, he looked 60. By 35, he was nearly blind and suffering from what was likely some form of neurodegenerative disorder. In his final years, he became obsessed with death. He kept skulls in his chamber and demanded to watch autopsies. He ordered his ancestors' remains exhumed so he could look upon the past, and reportedly kept bits of saintly relics in his pockets. He was convinced he was cursed, and in a way he wasn't wrong. A quirky and chilling side note. In one of the last letters written by a court official, Charles is described as the man who lives but is already past. He had stopped speaking coherently, his muscles had begun to waste, he drooled constantly, his sleep came in jagged snatches, and yet Spain still called him king, because there was no plan B. When Charles died in 1700 at the age of 38, his body was so misshapen that embalmers reportedly struggled to preserve it. His autopsy, possibly embellished by horrified physicians, noted that his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines rotted, and his brain filled with water. Whether these descriptions were accurate or rhetorical, they captured the general feeling. Charles had been more symbol than sovereign. The final breath of a dynasty too proud to admit it had been suffocating for generations. With Charles's death, the Spanish Habsburg line ended. Completely. No children, no heirs, no backup cousins with strong enough blood to claim the throne. His passing sparked the War of the Spanish Succession, a massive European conflict that redrew borders, and finally forced the great powers to reckon with what happens when you prioritise purity over practicality. France and Austria scrambled to fill the power vacuum while the Habsburg name, once synonymous with Europe itself, faded into antique footnotes and haunted portraits. Historians still argue whether Charles's condition was entirely genetic or compounded by illness, but few doubt he was the product of an experiment gone too far. His mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, and every woman before them had been part of the machine, handed off like royal chess pieces in an endless cycle of safe marriages. Each one inherited the same traits, passed on the same risks, and prayed for a different outcome. None got one. In Charles, we see what happens when those prayers run out. Next we take a breath, one last flicker before the end, as we visit the aftermath. What came after Charles, after the Habsburg fall? What happened to the women who survived the collapse, and how did Europe rebuild from the ruins of its most cursed crown? Now the curtain falls. Charles II is gone, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs buried, embalmed, and left behind in a vault carved with the ghosts of his ancestors. You'd think that would be the end of it, a final period on a long, tangled sentence. But history, especially royal history, doesn't end neatly. It frays, it lingers, it echoes in distant hallways and side branches. Tonight, we trace what came after the collapse, what happened to the world those women left behind, the ones who survived the dynasty's fall, the ones married off to clean up the mess, and the new royals who inherited kingdoms and bloodlines already soaked in superstition and genetic fatigue. With Charles II's death, in 1700 and no heir to take the throne, Europe did what it does best: panic, negotiate, and go to war. The War of the Spanish Succession kicked off almost immediately. It wasn't just about who got the Spanish crown, it was about whether France or Austria would dominate Europe. The Habsburgs, still strong in Austria, backed Archduke Charles, a distant cousin. France pushed forward Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV, the Sun King himself. You already know how this ends. Philip wins, but only after 12 years of bloodshed, a continent's worth of manoeuvring and treaties so convoluted they make royal marriage charts look like stick figures. So what happened to the women caught in the middle of all this? Many were exiled, some simply vanished into quieter courts, but a few became transitional figures, living links between the old inbred dynasties and the new, modernising powers that would eventually shake Europe loose from its old obsessions. One of the most important of these women was Elizabeth Farnese. Remember her? She was a distant cousin of the Habsburgs, married to Philip V of Spain, the first Bourbon king of the new regime. Elizabeth was clever, calculating, and determined to put her children on as many thrones as possible. She understood what her predecessors had ignored, that you can't keep marrying within a shrinking circle and expect the tree to grow, so she arranged matches across borders, Naples, Parma, Tuscany, expanding influence without relying on cousin-to-cousin recycling. You could argue she helped reboot the Spanish dynasty, even as its Habsburg roots were still tangled in the floorboards. Elizabeth also cleaned up after Charles. Literally. His court was purged of old guards and ghost advisors. She had his former queen, Maria Anna of Neuburg, politely removed from court and retired to a convent in Toledo, where she lived out her days writing angry letters and denying all rumours about her inability to produce heirs. Maria Anna, to her credit, maintained dignity, though it must have been difficult watching her adopted country shift away from the world she had been groomed to rule. And then there were the Austrian Habsburgs, still reigning in Vienna. Maria Theresa, born decades after Charles's death, carried on the name, but not the mistake. She married outside the Habsburg pool, bringing in Francis of Lorraine as her consort, effectively ending the most intense cycle of intra-family marriage. Their union produced 16 children, including Marie Antoinette, marking a brief return to fertility, vitality, and political savvy. But the shadows of the past lingered. The pressure to maintain dynastic integrity was still there, just masked in Enlightenment trappings and powdered wigs. A quirky and symbolic artefact of this shift? In the early 1700s, the Spanish royal court quietly retired the custom of cousin marriage as a preferred arrangement. They didn't abolish it, don't get too excited, but they began actively seeking partners from France, Italy, and those smaller German states. This wasn't reform driven by science, it was driven by trauma. No one wanted but another Charles II. His legacy had become a warning whispered through generations. Even so, traces of the old habits lingered. Bourbon France, for all its modern pretensions, still allowed first-cousin marriages. The British royal family too kept its bloodline looped tighter than it should have. Queen Victoria's children would marry into nearly every major royal house in Europe, including, fatefully, the Romanovs of Russia, spreading haemophilia like a royal calling card. The lesson of the Habsburgs wasn't ignored, well, exactly, but it wasn't fully learned either. And the Habsburg women? The ones who came after Charles? They weren't immune to the old expectations. They were still groomed from birth for marriage markets, still photographed and paraded and whispered about like expensive livestock, but their agency slowly increased. Maria Christina of Austria, for example, was allowed to marry for love, a scandal at the time, and a sign that even the oldest families were beginning to unlace their dynastic corsets, one ribbon at a time. A few decades after Charles's death, portraits of Habsburg women begin to shift. The chins soften, the jaws recede. Whether it's better breeding or better painters, we may never know. But the family face begins to fade from the canvas, replaced by powdered cheeks and lighter frames, the architecture of a new Europe being built with quieter tools. The scholarly debate continues, of course. Was it all about inbreeding? Probably not. The fall of the Spanish Habsburgs was political, economic and military, as much as it was genetic, but genetics gave it a face, one that people could point to, laugh at or pity. The women at the heart of that story were never villains, they were instruments, chosen, trained, married and bred in service of dynasties that couldn't admit they were breaking under their own weight. And here's the final irony. The dynasty that collapsed under inbreeding was also the one that left behind the most haunting images of what power really costs. Not just in battles and borders, but in lives, in miscarriages, in madness, in the crooked smiles of children who couldn't walk, couldn't talk, but were still expected to wear crowns. The real tragedy wasn't just the fall, it was how long it took anyone to say, maybe we should try something different. Next we'll wind down gently, closing the curtains on this sprawling tale, and let your mind drift away from court corridors and cousin marriages towards something a little quieter, a little softer. You've made it. Time to rest. So here you are. 30 sections, one royal bloodline and several centuries of questionable marriage decisions later. You made it through labyrinthine family trees, sagging jawlines, whispered scandals, stillborn heirs and dynasties that tied themselves into genetic knots with lace trim. Honestly, that's impressive, and probably a little concerning, but hey, if you have been lying in bed this whole time, fan humming in the background, trying to decide whether Joanna of Castile was really mad or just had the 1500s version of burnout, then congratulations, you're exactly the kind of night owl this journey was made for. We started with a simple question. How did royal women become the biological architects of Europe's most spectacular dynastic collapses? And it turns out the answer isn't all that simple. Yes, inbreeding played a starring role, but it wasn't the only villain. These women were born into systems built entirely on control, Control of bloodlines, control of territory, control of their very bodies. Whether they were crowned queens or married off at 15, their lives were scripted from birth, their destinies sealed by birthright and a family tree that looked more like a spiral staircase. And still, through miscarriages, madness, and the suffocating pressure of court life, they showed up. They ruled, they negotiated treaties, they raised armies, they educated children, and they wrote letters in 10 languages. Their stories aren't just about decline, they're about endurance, about what happens when women are expected to hold empires together with nothing more than diplomacy, piety, and a series of increasingly bad husbands. Now, as the dynastic dust settles, the lights dim behind the velvet curtains, and the smell of beeswax and old paper fades, it's time to drift away. Not into the chaos of royal courts or the weight of too many crowns, but into your own quiet space, away from the twisted thrones and the pressure of pedigree. You don't need to carry this lineage any further. Let your mind go soft. Let the names fade. Maria Anna, Margaret Theresa, Mariana of Austria, all of them slipping away like candle smoke. You're safe. You're warm. And you're definitely not about to marry your cousin. Sweet dreams, time traveller.